Sometimes the deepest wounds create the hardest hearts. Sometimes the cruelest masters hide the most broken souls. On the frontier of Blood Mesa, Ephraim Kane stands 7 feet tall and rules his cattle empire with an iron fist. After losing his wife to raiders, he buried his heart beneath layers of ice and rage. When starving Clara Whitlock arrives, begging for work, Ephraim takes her as property, not hired help. But Clara isn't the broken woman he expected. She works hard, speaks boldly, and meets his coldest stares with quiet strength. Slowly, she begins melting the frozen wasteland around his heart. When Clara's violent past catches up with her, will Ephraim fight for the woman who dared to love a monster? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Blood Mesa as Ephraim Kane stepped onto the wide porch of his ranch house, his boots echoing against weathered planks that had witnessed 20 years of his dominion. At 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, he commanded attention without speaking a word. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver at 35, caught the early light as he surveyed his empire 10,000 acres of prime grazing land that stretched to the horizon, dotted with cattle bearing his brand. This was his kingdom, built with his hands, defended with his guns, ruled by his will alone. The ranch house itself stood like a fortress against the harsh frontier elements, constructed from native stone and timber that could withstand both Apache raids and winter storms. Every board, every nail had been placed with purpose. No decoration softened its edges, no feminine touch warmed its corners. It was a man's dwelling, practical and imposing, much like the man who built it. Ephraim's weathered hands gripped the porch railing as he watched his ranch hands emerge from the bunkhouse, their movements efficient and respectful. They knew better than to dawdle under his watchful gaze. 23 men worked his spread, each one hand-picked for skill and loyalty. They respected him, feared him, and never questioned his orders. That was how he preferred it. Old Pete McReady, his foreman for 15 years, approached with the day's report. The grizzled cowboy's face bore the deep lines of a man who'd seen too much sun and too many hard winters, but his eyes remained sharp as flint. Pete was one of the few men who remembered Ephraim before the ice settled in his veins, before mercy became a luxury he couldn't afford. "Morning, boss," Pete said, tipping his hat. "Lost 2 head to coyotes near the north pasture. Found the remains this morning." Ephraim nodded, his expression unchanging. "Take Johnson and Miller, track them down. I won't have scavengers thinking my land is easy pickings." "Yes, sir." Pete hesitated, a gesture Ephraim didn't miss. "There's something else. 3 families came by yesterday evening after you'd gone inside. Drought hit them hard. They're offering labor for food and shelter." The drought. For 6 months, the rains had failed across the territory, turning green pastures to dust and forcing desperate people from their homesteads. Ephraim's wells ran deep, his cattle still found grass, but lesser men weren't so fortunate. They came to him hat in hand, pride swallowed, begging for scraps from his table. "Send them away," Ephraim said, his voice flat as winter ground. "I'm not running a charity." Pete shifted his weight, a sure sign he disagreed but knew better than to argue. "One of them family's just a woman on her own. Says she can cook, clean, tend animals. Looked half-starved, boss. Might be useful." Ephraim's jaw tightened. Women meant complications, emotions, softness he couldn't afford. His ranch ran like clockwork because every element served a purpose, and purposes didn't include nursing strays back to health. "Where is she now?" "Camped by the creek with the others. Told them you'd give an answer this morning." Ephraim descended the porch steps, his spurs chiming against the hard-packed earth. The sound was familiar, authoritative herald of his approach that made grown men straighten their spines. He'd worn these same spurs for 8 years, since the day he'd stripped them from a dead rustler who'd made the mistake of stealing his cattle. They'd belonged to that man's father, and his father before him. Now they belonged to Ephraim, like everything else he'd claimed, through strength and determination. The walk to the creek gave him time to think, to remember. 5 years ago, this same drought had brought other desperate souls to his door. He'd turned them all away except on a young Apache woman named Elena, who'd escaped a cavalry massacre. Sarah had begged him to let her stay, to give her sanctuary. Sarah, even thinking her name brought the familiar tightness to his chest, the weight that had settled there the day he'd buried her. His beautiful, gentle wife, who'd seen goodness in everyone, who'd believed love could conquer any hardship. She'd been wrong, of course. Love was a weakness that got you killed on the frontier. The memory surfaced unbidden, Sarah's laugh echoing through their home, her small hands tending the garden she'd planted despite his protests that flowers were frivolous. She'd worn blue that last morning, a dress she'd sewn herself with tiny pearl buttons down the front. He'd kissed her goodbye, promised to return before sunset with supplies from town. He'd returned to find their home in ashes, Sarah's body among the ruins. The Apache war party had struck without warning, taking livestock, burning buildings, killing anyone who couldn't flee fast enough. Elena had survived by hiding in the root cellar, but Sarah had been in the garden, tending her precious flowers when the raiders came. The blue dress was the only way he'd identified her remains. That night, kneeling in the ashes of his former life, Ephraim Kane had made himself a promise. Never again would he allow softness to take root in his heart. Never again would he provide targets for his enemies. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, and mercy was a weakness that invited destruction. The creek came into view, its waters running low but still clear over smooth stones. 3 families had indeed made camp on his land, without permission too, with wagons and children, one with nothing but a worn traveling pack and stubborn determination. The woman Pete had mentioned sat apart from the others, her back straight, despite obvious exhaustion. Ephraim studied her from a distance before making his approach known. She was young, perhaps 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple braid that revealed the elegant line of her neck. Her dress had once been fine blue wool, but now showed the wear of hard travel and harder times. Despite her circumstances, she carried herself with dignity, her chin raised as she watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Something about her posture reminded him of Sarah, the way she'd faced each morning with quiet hope despite the challenges ahead. The resemblance stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, an echo of warmth he'd thought long buried. Clara Whitlock turned at the sound of his approach, and Ephraim found himself looking into eyes the color of storm clouds, grey-blue and fierce with intelligence. Most people dropped their gaze when he drew near, intimidated by his size and reputation. This woman met his stare directly, unflinching. "You're Kane," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am. You're trespassing on my land. I'm waiting for your answer to my request for work." Her voice carried the accent of education, unusual for someone in her apparent circumstances. "Your foreman said you'd decide this morning." "I've decided. I don't need kitchen help." Clara stood, revealing a figure that even her worn dress couldn't disguise, curves in all the right places, long legs that spoke of strength rather than delicacy. But it was her eyes that held him, those storm-grey depths that seemed to see through his carefully constructed walls. "I can do more than kitchen work," she said. "I've handled cattle, broken horses, repaired equipment. I'm not afraid of hard labor. What I need is someone who follows orders without question, someone who understands their place." He let his gaze travel deliberately from her face to her feet and back, making his meaning clear. "Are you that someone, Miss Whitlock?" Color rose in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "I understand necessity, Mr. Kane. I understand survival. If working for you means eating regularly and sleeping under a roof, then yes, I can follow orders." Ephraim circled her slowly, the way he might evaluate a horse he was considering purchasing. She held still under his inspection, though her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Pride warred with desperation in her expression, and desperation was winning. "You'll work sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week," he said. "Sundays you'll handle necessary chores only." You'll eat what the hands eat, sleep where I tell you to sleep, and speak when spoken to. You belong to me until your debt is paid. Food, shelter, clothing, all come with a price. What debt? Clara asked, her voice sharpening. The debt you owe for the privilege of surviving under my protection. Room and board aren't free, Miss Whitlock. Every meal you eat, every night you spend safe from raiders and wild animals adds to what you owe me. Work hard enough, long enough, and maybe someday you'll earn your freedom. The words tasted bitter on his tongue, harsher than he'd intended. But weakness invited exploitation, and he couldn't afford to appear soft in front of his men or the other desperate families watching this exchange. Clara's storm-cloud eyes flashed with anger, but she swallowed whatever sharp reply had risen to her lips. She needed this chance too badly to let pride destroy it. How long? She asked quietly. As long as it takes, could be months, could be years. Depends on how valuable you make yourself. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of running water and distant cattle lowing. Clara Whitlock stood at a crossroads, and they both knew it. Accept his terms and become little better than an indentured servant, or walk away and face starvation on the unforgiving frontier. I accept, she said finally. Ephraim felt something twist in his chest, satisfaction, mixed with an emotion he refused to name. Pete will show you to the servants' quarters. You start work immediately. As he turned to walk away, Clara's voice stopped him. Mr. Kane, what happened to your last kitchen help? He looked back over his shoulder, his expression cold as winter stone. She got ideas above her station. I don't tolerate that kind of trouble twice. The lie came easily. There had been no previous kitchen help, no woman to break and discard. But Clara didn't need to know that. She needed to understand that his mercy had limits, that gratitude was expected, and that her position here was precarious at best. Walking back toward the ranch house, Ephraim tried to ignore the weight of Pete's disapproving stare. His foreman had known Sarah, had seen how love had softened the hard edges of frontier life. Pete probably thought this arrangement was cruel, unnecessary. Pete was wrong. Cruelty was leaving Clara Whitlock to starve by the creek. This was survival, hers and his. She would work, earn her keep, and eventually move on to whatever life awaited her beyond his property lines. Until then, she belonged to him, and he would protect what was his. But as he climbed the steps to his empty house, Ephraim couldn't shake the memory of storm-grey eyes that had looked at him without fear. Most people saw a monster when they looked at him, a giant who'd built his empire on violence and intimidation. Clara Whitlock had seen something else entirely, though he couldn't name what it was. Hidden beneath his shirt, suspended on a thin gold chain, Sarah's wedding ring rested against his heart, reminder of love's price and the warmth that had once lived in his chest. He'd worn it there for 5 years, a talisman against the temptation to feel again. As he watched Clara disappear into the servants' quarters with Pete, Ephraim touched the ring through his shirt and made himself a promise. This woman would not breach his defenses. She would work, serve her purpose, and leave his heart exactly as untouched as she'd found it. Some promises, he would learn, were easier made than kept. Clara's first week at the Kane Ranch passed in a blur of back-breaking labor and stubborn determination. Every dawn found her in the kitchen before the cook's crow announced sunrise, her hands already busy preparing meals for 23 hungry ranch hands. Every sunset saw her scrubbing the last pot by lamplight, her back aching and her fingers raw from lye soap. She hauled water from the well until her shoulders screamed in protest. She mucked out stalls until the smell of horse manure seemed permanently embedded in her clothing. She swept, scrubbed, mended, and cooked with the mechanical efficiency of someone who understood that survival depended on proving her worth. Ephraim watched her from a distance, his expression unreadable as granite. He never spoke to her directly after that first morning by the creek, but she felt his presence like a storm cloud on the horizon, dark, imposing, and potentially dangerous. His orders came through Pete or the other hands, instructions delivered with military precision that brooked no argument. Boss wants the harness leather oiled before noon. Kane says the chicken coop needs mucking out. Mr. Ephraim's expecting his shirts mended by evening. Clara followed each directive without complaint, though she noticed the way some of the younger ranch hands watched her with speculation in their eyes. She was neither servant nor family, neither employee nor guest. Her status remained deliberately unclear, a limbo that kept everyone guessing about her true position in Ephraim's kingdom. The breaking point came on Thursday, when the temperature soared past 100 degrees and the sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil. Clara had been hauling water for the horses since dawn, her body drenched in sweat and her vision beginning to blur from the heat. Each bucket felt heavier than the last, each step across the dusty yard more difficult to complete. She'd made perhaps 50 trips when her legs finally betrayed her. The wooden bucket slipped from nerveless fingers as Clara crumpled to the ground, unconsciousness claiming her before she could break her fall. The last thing she heard was the sound of water splashing across thirsty earth. When she opened her eyes, she found herself lying in the shade of the barn, Doc Morrison's weathered face peering down at her with professional concern. The elderly physician had served the territory for 30 years, treating everything from gunshot wounds to difficult births. His presence at the ranch meant someone had been worried enough to send for him. "Easy there, young lady," Doc Morrison said, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. "Heat got the better of you. Nothing a little rest and water won't cure." Clara struggled to sit up, panic flooding through her as reality returned. "I have to work. Mr. Kane expects." "Mr. Kane expects his people to be useful, not dead," the doctor interrupted gently, "though I suspect he's having some thoughts about that arrangement right about now." Through the barn's open doorway, Clara could see Ephraim standing in conversation with Pete, their voices too low to carry, but their body language suggesting disagreement. Pete gestured toward the barn several times, while Ephraim's posture remained rigid, unmovable. "He's angry," Clara whispered. Doc Morrison followed her gaze and chuckled. "Ephraim Kane's been angry for 5 years running. Question is whether he's angry at you or at himself." Before Clara could ask what he meant, heavy footsteps approached the barn. Ephraim filled the doorway, his shadow falling across her prone form like a judgment. His dark eyes swept over her disheveled appearance, the sweat-stained dress, the tangled hair, the pallor that spoke of exhaustion pushed too far. "Can she work?" he asked Doc Morrison, his tone flat. "Not in this heat, not without proper rest and food. Girl's been pushing herself too hard." She knew the terms when she accepted the position. Doc Morrison stood, his slight frame dwarfed by Ephraim's massive presence, but his voice carrying the authority of age and experience. The terms didn't include working her to death. "You want a corpse on your conscience, Ephraim, because that's what you'll have if you keep driving her like this." Something flickered across Ephraim's features, surprise perhaps, or irritation at being challenged. Most people in the territory treated him with the deference due to his wealth and reputation. Doc Morrison was one of the few who remembered him as a young man before grief had calcified his heart. "She'll rest today," Ephraim said finally. "Tomorrow she returns to work. Tomorrow she works reasonable hours, or I'll be back to treat her for something worse than heat exhaustion." The two men stared at each other in a battle of wills that stretched for long seconds. Finally, Ephraim nodded curtly and turned to leave. At the barn entrance, he paused without looking back. "Pete will bring you food. Stay out of the sun until evening." The words were gruff, lacking any warmth, but Clara heard something beneath the harsh tone, concern, perhaps, or simple pragmatism. Either way, it was more consideration than she'd expected from the man who claimed to own her labor. As evening approached and the temperature finally began to drop, Clara made her way to the horse corral on unsteady legs. The incident had shaken her more than she cared to admit, forcing her to confront the reality of her situation. She was truly alone here, dependent on Ephraim's whims for survival, with nowhere to run if things went badly. The injured horse stood apart from the others, favoring his left foreleg, where a sharp stone had opened a gash 3 days earlier. The other hands had done their best to clean and bandage the wound, but the animal remained skittish and difficult to approach. Clara had watched their attempts with growing frustration, recognizing the signs of fear and pain that made him lash out at anyone who came near. Now, moving slowly to avoid startling him, she approached the fence with gentle words and outstretched hands. The horse's ears flicked toward her voice as she hummed softly, a lullaby her mother had sung years ago, when nightmares made sleep impossible. "Easy there, beautiful," she murmured, letting him catch her scent before making any sudden movements. "I know you're hurting. I know you don't trust anyone right now. But sometimes we have to let someone help us, even when we're scared." The horse snorted and tossed his head, but he didn't retreat when Clara slipped through the fence rails. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, continuing the wordless melody that seemed to calm his restless energy. When she finally reached his side, he stood still and allowed her to examine the wound. The bandage needed changing, and the cut showed signs of infection, despite the hand's best efforts. Clara had treated similar injuries before, during her years helping her father with their small farm's livestock. The memory brought a pang of longing for simpler times when her biggest worry had been whether the chickens were laying enough eggs for market. "You need better medicine," she told the horse, stroking his neck with gentle fingers, "and someone who knows how to clean a wound properly." "Do you?" Clara spun around to find Ephraim standing behind her, close enough that she wondered how long he'd been watching. In the fading light, his features appeared softer somehow, less intimidating than usual. The harsh lines around his eyes remained, but something in his expression had shifted. "I've treated animals before," she said carefully. "My father raised cattle before I came here." Ephraim stepped closer to the horse, his presence causing the animal to tense with renewed wariness. "Johnson tried to doctor him yesterday, nearly got kicked in the head for his trouble. He's in pain. Pain makes every creature defensive." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond their literal meaning. Clara sensed they were talking about more than just an injured horse, though she couldn't have explained why. "Fix him," Ephraim said simply. It wasn't a request, but wasn't quite an order either. Clara nodded and set to work, her movements sure and competent as she cleaned the wound with water Pete brought from the well. The horse remained calm under her touch, responding to her gentle voice and steady hands. As she worked, Ephraim watched in silence from the other side of the fence. Clara found herself hyper-aware of his presence, the way his dark eyes tracked her every movement. Most of the time, she felt invisible to him, a piece of equipment to be used and forgotten. Now, for reasons she couldn't fathom, she had his complete attention. The wound was worse than it had appeared from a distance. Infection had taken hold, requiring careful cleaning and proper medication to prevent serious complications. Clara worked methodically, removing debris and dead tissue while humming softly to keep the horse calm. "Where did you learn to do that?" Ephraim asked. Clara glanced up, surprised by the genuine curiosity in his voice. "My father. He said animals were often better patients than people. They don't argue with the treatment or pretend they know better than the doctor. Your father was a rancher, a farmer. Small operation compared to this." She gestured toward the vast expanse of cane land, visible beyond the corral. "But he loved his animals. Said treating them right was the mark of a good man." Ephraim's expression darkened. "Good men don't last long out here." "Maybe they do. Maybe they just look different than you expect." The words escaped before Clara could stop them, and she immediately regretted the implied criticism. Ephraim Kane held her life in his hands, and challenging his worldview was dangerous territory for someone in her position. But instead of anger, she saw something else flicker across his features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a truth he'd forgotten. The moment passed quickly, buried beneath his habitual mask of cold control. "Get back to the house," he said abruptly. "You've done enough for one day." Clara finished bandaging the horse's leg and gathered her supplies, acutely aware of Ephraim's continued scrutiny. As she prepared to leave the corral, the horse nuzzled her shoulder gently, a gesture of trust that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. It had been so long since any living creature had shown her affection. Clara. She turned, shocked to hear her name on his lips for the first time since their initial meeting. Ephraim stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, his massive frame backlit by the last rays of sunset. The horse, what would you call him? Hope, she said without thinking. I'd call him Hope. Ephraim nodded slowly, as if the name carried significance she couldn't understand. Hope it is, then. That night, as Clara lay on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, she replayed the day's events in her mind. Something had shifted between them during those moments by the Kerala crack in Ephraim's armor that revealed glimpses of the man he might have been before grief hardened his heart. She thought about the way he'd watched her tend to Hope, the genuine interest in his questions about her past. For a few precious minutes, she'd felt like a person rather than property, someone whose thoughts and experiences mattered. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew. Ephraim Kane had made his position clear. She belonged to him, nothing more than an investment in labor and obedience. Allowing herself to hope for more would only lead to heartbreak. But as sleep finally claimed her, Clara couldn't shake the memory of storm-grey eyes that had looked at her with something approaching respect. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to Ephraim Kane than the cold tyrant he pretended to be. In the ruins of his old homestead, hidden beneath charred timber and broken dreams, a blood-stained Apache arrow caught the moonlight like an omen. Soon, it would surface to remind Ephraim of everything he'd lost and everything he still had left to lose. The melody haunted Ephraim's dreams. He woke before dawn, as was his custom, but instead of the usual silence that greeted his consciousness, he heard Clara's wordless humming echoing in his memory. The tune was hauntingly familiar, stirring something deep in his chest that he'd thought long buried. Sarah used to hum that same melody while she worked in her garden, her voice soft and sweet as she tended her precious flowers. The memory struck him like a physical blow, so vivid he could almost smell the lavender she'd planted by their bedroom window. Ephraim sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, fighting the wave of grief that threatened to overwhelm him. 5 years should have been long enough to forget such details, but the human heart proved stubbornly resistant to such logic. Sarah's humming, Clara's voice, the similarity was uncanny and deeply unsettling. He dressed quickly and stepped onto his porch, where the pre-dawn darkness still held dominion over the land. From his vantage point, he could see a light burning in the kitchen window, evidence that Clara had already begun her daily labors. The woman was nothing if not determined. He'd give her that. Over the past week, she'd proven herself far more capable than he'd anticipated. The broken water pump that had plagued them for months suddenly worked smoothly after she'd spent an afternoon with a wrench and some creative engineering. The supply room, previously a chaotic mess of tools and materials, was now organized with military precision. Even the temperamental stove that had frustrated 3 different cooks now produced consistent heat under her careful attention. Most surprising of all, she'd begun earning the respect of his ranch handsmen, who typically treated outsiders with suspicion and women with barely concealed disdain. They tipped their hats when she passed, helped her carry heavy loads without being asked, and spoke to her with the courtesy due a lady rather than hired help. Ephraim found this development both impressive and troubling. He deliberately kept Clara's status ambiguous to prevent exactly this kind of acceptance. She was meant to be temporary, forgettable, someone who carved out a permanent place in the ranch's daily operations. Yet as he watched her through the kitchen window, efficiently preparing breakfast for 23 hungry men, he couldn't deny her value. Clara Whitlock was proving herself indispensable, and that made her dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with weapons or warfare. The morning passed in its usual routine of cattle inspections, equipment maintenance, and strategic planning. Ephraim threw himself into the work with particular intensity, using physical activity to silence the unwelcome thoughts that plagued his mind. But even the demands of running a vast cattle operation couldn't completely distract him from Clara's presence. She was everywhere hauling supplies to the barn, mending harnesses with quick, competent fingers, consulting with Pete about meal planning for the coming week. Each task was completed with quiet efficiency, but Ephraim noticed details his men missed. The way she paused to scratch behind a dog's ears, the encouraging word she offered to a young hand struggling with a difficult horse, the gentle correction of a mistake that saved face while ensuring the job was done properly. These small kindnesses reminded him painfully of Sarah, who'd possessed the same gift for making everyone around her feel valued and cared for. The comparison was unwelcome and persistent, like a splinter that worked deeper with each attempt to ignore it. "You're wearing a groove in that porch, boss." Ephraim turned to find Pete approaching with the day's report, his weathered face creased with concern. The foreman had been watching him with increasing scrutiny since Clara's arrival, clearly noting changes in his employer's behavior. "Cattle count?" Ephraim asked, deflecting the unspoken question. "All accounted for. Johnson and Miller tracked down that coyote pack, won't be bothering us again." Pete hesitated, then forged ahead with characteristic bluntness. "That girl's been asking about the ranch's history. Wants to know how long you've been here, what happened to the previous owners." Ephraim's jaw tightened. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you built this place from nothing, turned it into the biggest spread in 3 territories, through hard work and smart decisions." She seemed impressed. The compliment should have pleased him, but instead it sparked irritation. Ephraim didn't need Clara's approval or admiration. Her opinion of his accomplishments was irrelevant to their business arrangement. "She's getting ideas above her station," he said coldly. Pete's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. "Ideas? Like what?" "Like she belongs here permanently. Like she's more than hired help. Maybe she is more than hired help. Maybe she's what this place has been missing." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Pete was treading on dangerous ground, challenging assumptions that Ephraim had built his entire post-Sarah existence upon. The ranch was complete as it was efficient, profitable, and free from the emotional complications that women inevitably brought. "This conversation is over," Ephraim said with finality. Pete nodded, but didn't retreat. "Ephraim, I knew you before Sarah died. I remember what you were like when you had something to live for besides work and revenge. That man was happier, and he was a hell of a lot better company." Before Ephraim could respond, Pete tipped his hat and walked away, leaving his employer alone with thoughts he'd rather not examine. The foreman's words stung because they carried truth. Ephraim had been a different man when Sarah was alive, more open, more willing to see good in the world around him. But that man had been naive, vulnerable to the kind of devastating loss that could destroy everything he'd built. The current version of Ephraim Kane was harder, more practical, and infinitely safer from the pain that love inevitably brought. As afternoon faded into evening, Ephraim found himself walking toward the corral, where Hope grazed peacefully with the other horses. Clara's treatment had worked. The infection was clearing, and the animal moved without favoring his injured leg. It was a small victory, but victories had been rare enough in Ephraim's life that he'd learned to acknowledge them when they occurred. Clara emerged from the barn as he approached, her arms full of fresh hay for the horses' evening feed. She'd changed from her work dress into something simpler, a white cotton blouse and dark skirt that emphasized her natural grace. Her auburn hair had escaped its usual braid, framing her face in soft waves that caught the golden light of sunset. The sight of her stopped Ephraim cold. For a moment, she looked so much like Sarah in the garden that his breath caught in his throat. The same gentle beauty, the same unconscious elegance, the same air of quiet competence that suggested she could handle whatever challenges life presented. But where Sarah had been soft and yielding, Clara possessed an inner strength that showed in the set of her shoulders and the direct way she met his gaze. She'd been forged by hardship into something resilient and unbreakably survivor, who'd learned to find beauty even in difficult circumstances. "Hope's doing well," she said, gesturing toward the healing horse. "The infection's nearly gone. He should be ready for light work within the week." Ephraim nodded, not trusting his voice. Up close, The resemblance to Sarah was less pronounced. Clara's features were sharper, her eyes more stormy than serene. But something about her presence still stirred memories he'd thought safely buried. "You have experience with horses," he said finally. "Some. My father bred them along with the cattle. Nothing as fine as your animals, but good, sturdy stock." Clara reached out to stroke Hope's neck, her touch gentle but confident. "This one reminds me of a mare. We had same intelligence in the eyes, same stubborn streak when she didn't want to be caught." "What happened to your father's operation?" The question surprised them both. Ephraim had made it a policy not to inquire about his employees' backgrounds, finding that such knowledge created unwanted emotional connections. But Clara's story intrigued him despite his better judgment. Clara's expression grew distant, shadowed by memories that brought pain. "Drought took the cattle 3 years ago. Then raiders burned the barn and killed half the horses. Papa never recovered from the loss, died that winter from grief, as much as from the fever. And you?" "I survived. That's what Papa taught me to do, survive whatever comes, keep moving forward, never give up hope that things might get better." The words resonated with something deep in Ephraim's chest, a recognition of shared pain and the strength required to endure it. They'd both lost everything they'd held dear, both been forced to rebuild their lives from ashes and determination. "Your father sounds like a wise man," he said quietly. Clara's smile was soft, but tinged with sadness. "He was. He used to say that how we treat the helpless animals, children, people who can't defend themselves, that's what reveals our true character. Actions matter more than words, kindness more than strength." The implicit criticism in her words wasn't lost on Ephraim. She was challenging his treatment of her, his harsh terms and cold demeanor, but doing so with such subtlety that he couldn't take offense without appearing petty. It was a masterful piece of verbal maneuvering that suggested intelligence far beyond what her circumstances might indicate. "Your father never had to run a ranch this size," Ephraim said defensively. "Kindness is a luxury when you're responsible for 23 men's lives and thousands head of cattle." "Is it, or is it just another kind of strength?" Before he could formulate a response, Clara had gathered her skirts and walked back toward the main house, leaving him alone with Hope and his increasingly uncomfortable thoughts. The woman had a gift for asking questions that undermined the foundations of his carefully constructed worldview. That night, as he sat in his study reviewing account books by lamplight, Ephraim found his attention wandering to the window that overlooked the servants' quarters. A soft glow emanated from Clara's window, suggesting she was still awake despite the late hour. He wondered what occupied her thoughts, what dreams and fears kept sleep at bay. The curiosity was dangerous, he knew. Personal interest in Clara's inner life could only lead to the kind of emotional involvement he'd sworn to avoid. Yet he couldn't quite force himself to close the curtains and turn away from that distant light. From somewhere in the darkness, he heard the faint sound of humming, that same haunting melody that had disturbed his sleep and stirred his memories. Sarah's song, now claimed by another woman's voice, drifted across the night air like a ghost from his buried past. Ephraim closed his eyes and let the music wash over him, allowing himself this one moment of weakness before the harsh demands of morning forced him back into the role of the merciless tyrant. For just a few minutes, he could remember what it felt like to hope that tomorrow might bring something more than mere survival. The melody faded, replaced by silence and the distant sounds of night creatures going about their business. But its echo lingered in Ephraim's mind, a reminder that even the coldest hearts could still recognize beauty when it touched them. In the darkness of her room, Clara sat by her small window and wondered if the light in Ephraim's study meant he'd heard her humming. The melody was one of her few connections to happier times, when her mother had sung her to sleep and her father had filled their modest home with laughter. Now it seemed to bridge the gap between past and present, between the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming under Ephraim Kane's harsh tutelage. Change was coming to Blood Mesa Ranch, whether either of them was ready for it or not. Clara's fingers traced the edge of the hidden letter beneath her mattress, her heart pounding with the familiar rhythm of fear and regret. She'd carried Marcus Blackwood's final correspondence for 3 years now, reading it only when nightmares made sleep impossible, and she needed to remind herself why she could never stop running. The paper was worn soft from countless foldings, the ink faded but still legible in the moonlight that filtered through her small window. Marcus had written it the night before she'd killed him, his words a mixture of threats and promises that still made her stomach turn with remembered terror. "My dearest wife, you cannot hide from me forever. Every mile you run only delays the inevitable reunion that God has decreed. When I find you, and I will find you, your punishment will be measured in years, not days. But I am a forgiving man, Clara. Return to me willingly, and I will be gentle in your correction." Clara forced herself to stop reading. The letter contained 3 more pages of similar promises, each more terrifying than the last. Marcus Blackwood had been a master of manipulation, skilled at using love as a weapon and forgiveness as a threat. Even in death, his words retained their power to make her hands shake with remembered helplessness. She folded the letter carefully and returned it to its hiding place. Outside her window, Blood Mesa Ranch slept peacefully under a blanket of stars, its quietude a sharp contrast to the storm raging in her mind. For the first time in 3 years, she'd begun to feel safe, a dangerous emotion that made Marcus's memory even more threatening. Ephraim Kane might be harsh and demanding, but he wasn't cruel in the way Marcus had been cruel. There was honor in his hardness, purpose in his rules. When he looked at her, she saw assessment rather than ownership, calculation rather than the sick hunger that had lived in Marcus's eyes. The realization that she was beginning to trust Ephraim terrified her more than any physical threat could have. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness that had nearly cost her life once before. Yet with each passing day, she found herself lowering her guard in dangerous increments. Morning brought the usual routine of cooking and cleaning, but Clara noticed subtle changes in the way Ephraim's men treated her. Where once they'd been politely distant, now they sought her opinion on small matters, the best way to treat a sick calf, whether the approaching weather would hold long enough to finish repairs on the north fence, her thoughts on the quality of the new grain shipment. These consultations surprised her with their genuine respect. These were hard men, forged by frontier life into practical pragmatists who valued competence above all else. That they'd come to trust her judgment spoke to accomplishments she barely recognized in herself. "Miss Clara," called Tommy Rodriguez, one of the younger hands, as she emerged from the chicken coop with a basket of fresh eggs. "Could you take a look at Ranger's eye? Something's got him spooked, and he won't let any of us near enough to see what's wrong." Clara followed Tommy to the horse corral, where a magnificent black stallion stood apart from the other animals, his head held high in obvious agitation. Ranger was Ephraim's personal mount, a creature as proud and independent as his master. That he was showing distress meant something was seriously wrong. "Easy, beautiful," Clara murmured, approaching slowly with her hands visible and unthreatening. "Let me see what's troubling you." The horse's ears flicked toward her voice, and after a moment's hesitation, he allowed her to draw close enough to examine his left eye. Clara found the problem immediately, small thorn embedded in the sensitive skin above his eyelid, causing irritation and partial vision impairment. "Get me some clean water and tweezers," she instructed Tommy, "and find something to distract him, maybe some of those apples from the kitchen." Working with infinite patience, Clara removed the thorn and cleaned the small wound while Ranger munched contentedly on apple slices. The procedure was delicate work, requiring steady hands and absolute trust between horse and healer. Any sudden movement could result in serious injury to both parties. Impressive. Clara turned to find Ephraim watching from the fence rail, his dark eyes fixed on her with that unsettling intensity she'd begun to recognize. How long had he been standing there? And why did his presence make her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear? "It was just a thorn," she said, stepping back as Ranger shook his head experimentally. "Nothing serious. Ranger doesn't let anyone except me handle him. He's thrown 3 different ranch hands who tried to treat minor injuries." Clara shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise she heard in his voice. Animals can sense intention. He knew I meant to help, not hurt. Ephraim vaulted over the fence with surprising grace for such a large man, his boots hitting the ground with barely a sound. Up close, Clara could see details usually hidden by distance, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the silver threads in his dark hair, the way his shirt stretched across the powerful muscles of his chest and shoulders. "You have a gift," he said simply. "Why aren't you using it somewhere better than a kitchen?" The question caught Clara off guard with its implications. Was Ephraim suggesting her current position was somehow inadequate, or was he merely curious about the choices that had brought her to his ranch? "Gift or not, I need to eat," she replied carefully. "Your kitchen provides that opportunity. There are other opportunities, better ones." Clara felt a flutter of hope, followed immediately by suspicion. Men like Ephraim Kane didn't offer better opportunities without expecting something in return, and she'd learned to be wary of any bargain that seemed too generous. What kind of opportunities? Work with the horses, training, breeding, medical care. Pete's getting too old to handle the more difficult animals, and I need someone with real skill to take over those responsibilities. The offer was tempting, almost beyond resistance. Clara had always felt more comfortable with animals than people, more confident in the barn than the kitchen. Working with Ephraim's magnificent horses would be a dream come true under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Clara couldn't afford to forget the precarious nature of her position. Accepting greater responsibility would make her more valuable to Ephraim, but it would also make her more visible to anyone who might be searching for a woman with her particular skills. "I'm not sure that's wise," she said finally. "I'm still learning your ways, your expectations. Perhaps in time, when I've proven myself more thoroughly." Ephraim's expression shifted, disappointment flickering across his features before being replaced by the familiar mask of cold control. "As you wish. The offer stands, if you change your mind." He turned to leave, but Clara's voice stopped him. "Mr. Kane, thank you for thinking I might be capable of more than kitchen work." The words were simple, but they carried weight beyond their literal meaning. Clara was acknowledging not just his professional assessment, but also his recognition of her as a person with skills and potential rather than merely a source of labor. Ephraim looked back over his shoulder, something unreadable flickering in his dark eyes. "Capability was never in question, Miss Whitlock. The question is what you're running from that makes you afraid to claim what you've earned." The observation was too perceptive, too close to truths Clara couldn't afford to examine. She watched Ephraim walk away with a mixture of gratitude and terror, knowing that his growing interest in her background could prove as dangerous as any external threat. That evening brought unexpected drama when a violent thunderstorm rolled across Blood Mesa with the sudden fury typical of high desert weather. Rain hammered the roof of the main house like bullets, while lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, stark moments of white-hot brilliance. Clara was preparing to retire when she heard the distressed lowing of cattle from the south pasture. The sound was wrong, not the usual complaint of animals seeking shelter, but the panicked cries of creatures in genuine distress. Without stopping to consider the wisdom of her actions, she grabbed a lantern and headed into the storm. The rain was cold and driving, soaking through her shawl within seconds and making the muddy ground treacherous underfoot. But Clara pressed on, guided by the increasingly frantic sounds of animal distress and the occasional flash of lightning that revealed the landscape in startling detail. She found the problem near the creek, where rising water had trapped a pregnant cow on a small island of higher ground. The animal was clearly in labor, her sides heaving with contractions while floodwaters swirled around her hooves. Any attempt to cross the creek would likely result in drowning for both mother and calf. Clara was debating her options when another figure materialized out of the storm. Ephraim, carrying a coiled rope and wearing the grim expression of a man prepared for difficult work. He took in the situation with a single, comprehensive glance. "How long has she been laboring?" he shouted over the thunder. "I don't know," Clara called back, "but she's in trouble. The calf's positioned wrong. I can see the feet, but they're backward. Ephraim swore creatively, his words mostly lost in the storm's fury. A breech birth complicated by flooding and a panicked mother-it was a nightmare scenario that could easily result in losing both animals. "Can you handle a rope?" he asked. Clara nodded, and Ephraim began fashioning a makeshift harness around his chest and shoulders. His plan became clear. As he waded into the rushing water, he intended to cross the creek and attempt to deliver the calf manually, while Clara managed the rope from solid ground. The next hour passed in a blur of desperate activity. Ephraim fought the current and the cow's panicked struggles, while Clara played out line and hauled back when necessary, both of them working with the wordless coordination of a team that had trained together for years, rather than strangers, thrust together by circumstance. When the calf finally emerged alive, breathing and bawling with indignant vigor, Clara felt tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. The sight of new life entering the world never failed to move her, but tonight it seemed especially miraculous given the circumstances. Ephraim managed to guide mother and baby to higher ground as the storm began to abate, his massive frame supporting the exhausted cow until she could stand on her own. By the time they reached the barn, both humans were soaked to the skin and shaking with exhaustion, but the satisfaction of success made every discomfort worthwhile. "You did good work tonight," Ephraim said as they toweled off the newborn calf. His voice was gruff with fatigue, but Clara heard genuine respect in his tone. Most people would have stayed inside and let nature take its course. "Most people don't understand that sometimes nature needs help," Clara replied, rubbing circulation back into her frozen fingers. "Besides, losing a cow and calf would have cost you money. I'm protecting your investment." It was a practical explanation that avoided the emotional truth she'd acted out of compassion, unable to ignore suffering when she had the skills to help. But Ephraim saw through her deflection with uncomfortable clarity. "Money had nothing to do with it," he said quietly. "You risked your life for animals that mean nothing to you personally. That takes a special kind of courage." Their eyes met across the small space of the stall, and Clara felt something shift between thema recognition, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of shared values that transcended their business arrangement. For a moment, the barn felt charged with more than the lingering electricity of the departing storm. Then Ephraim stepped back, breaking the spell with characteristic abruptness. "Get inside and change into dry clothes. Can't afford to have you catch pneumonia." Clara nodded and gathered her sodden shawl, but paused at the barn door. "Thank you for trusting me with the rope. I know it wasn't an easy decision." "Trust has to be earned," Ephraim said. "Tonight, you earned it." The words followed Clara back to her quarters, warming her more effectively than the dry clothes she changed into or the cup of hot tea she brewed on her small stove. Ephraim Kane's trust was not given lightly, she realized. The fact that he'd risked his life based on her assessment of the situation spoke to a respect she'd never expected to achieve. As she finally settled into bed, Clara allowed herself a moment of dangerous hope. Perhaps she could build a life here, earn not just shelter and food, but genuine acceptance and security. Perhaps the past could truly remain buried if she was careful enough, useful enough, valuable enough to protect. It was a beautiful dream, made more precious by its fragility. But as Clara drifted toward sleep, she clutched Marcus's letter beneath her pillow and reminded herself that some sins were too great for forgiveness, some crimes too serious for escape. The storm had passed, but the real tempest was still gathering on the horizon, carried by men who would never stop hunting and a past that refused to stay buried. Clara Whitlock had found peace at Blood Mesa Ranch, but peace was always temporary for those who lived with blood on their hands. In the main house, Ephraim sat by his bedroom window and watched the light fade in Clara's quarters. Tonight had changed something fundamental between them, creating a bond forged by shared danger and mutual respect. She'd proven herself his equal in courage and competence, worthy of the partnership he'd never thought to offer another human being. The realization should have alarmed him. Instead, it filled him with a warmth he'd thought forever lost the possibility that he might not have to face the future entirely alone. Clara Whitlock was becoming indispensable to his ranch and dangerous to his heart, but for the first time in 5 years, Ephraim found himself willing to accept both risks. Change was coming to Blood Mesa, riding on storm winds and carried in storm-grey eyes that saw too much and promised even more. The silver locket felt cold against Clara's palm as she studied the 2 photographs nestled within its heart-shaped frame. The first showed her parents on their wedding day, young, hopeful, radiating the kind of love that believed it could conquer any obstacle. The second revealed a different kind of love entirely. Marcus Blackwood, in his judge's robes, his handsome face wearing the gentle expression he'd perfected for public appearances. She'd torn up every other photograph of her late husband, burned every letter except the final one, destroyed every tangible reminder of their marriage except this locket. Marcus had given it to her on their first anniversary, and she'd treasured it then as proof of his devotion. Now it served as a reminder of how thoroughly love could deceive, how completely she'd misread the character of the man she'd promised to honor and obey. Clara snapped the locket shut and tucked it back beneath her dress, against her heart, where its weight served as constant penance. She'd killed Marcus Blackwood with his own letter opener, driving the blade between his ribs when his latest correction had gone too far. The memory of his shocked expression still haunted her dreams, not because she regretted the act, but because she discovered a capacity for violence within herself that terrified her more than his brutality ever had. The soft knock on her door interrupted her dark reflections. "Clara, you ready for breakfast service?" Pete's voice carried the respectful tone she'd grown accustomed to over the past month. The old foreman had become her unlikely ally, offering advice on ranch politics and running interference when the younger hands got too curious about her background. She suspected he knew more about her situation than he let on. But Pete McReady was a man who understood the value of strategic ignorance. "Coming," Clara called, tucking the locket more securely beneath her collar. The morning routine awaited cooking for 23 hungry men, managing supplies, handling the dozen small crises that always seemed to arise before noon. It was honest work that left little time for brooding over past mistakes. But as she stepped outside, Clara noticed something different in the atmosphere of the ranch. Conversations stopped abruptly when she appeared, and several of the hands quickly averted their eyes. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The easy camaraderie she'd built with Ephraim's men had been replaced by a careful distance that spoke to new information or fresh suspicions. Her first clue to the source of the problem came from Tommy Rodriguez, who approached her with the nervous energy of a man delivering bad news. "Miss Clara, boss wants to see you in his study after breakfast. Says it's important." Clara's stomach clenched with familiar dread. Important meetings with powerful men rarely ended well in her experience. "Did he say what about?" "No, ma'am. But there was a rider came through yesterday evening after you'd gone to bed. Stayed about an hour, then left without stopping to rest his horse." Had the boss looking mighty troubled. A rider with urgent business who couldn't spare time for common courtesy that suggested official business of the worst kind. Clara forced herself to maintain her composure while her mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had someone recognized her? Was her carefully constructed new life about to crumble beneath the weight of her past sins? Breakfast passed in a blur of automatic motions and forced normalcy. Clara cooked, served, and cleaned with mechanical precision while her thoughts spiraled through increasingly dark scenarios. The ranch hands seemed to sense her distraction, offering only perfunctory thanks before hurrying away to their daily tasks. When the last dish was washed and put away, Clara made her way to Ephraim's study with leaden feet. The oak door stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of book-lined shelves and a massive desk that dominated the room like a throne. She knocked softly and waited for permission to enter. "Come in." Ephraim's voice carried none of its usual gruff warmth. Clara stepped inside to find him standing with his back to the door, staring out the window at his vast domain. His posture was rigid with tension, and she noticed his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Kane?" "Sit down." The words were clipped, formal, entirely unlike the man who'd worked beside her in the storm just days earlier. Clara took the chair facing his desk and folded her hands in her lap, struggling to project calm she didn't feel. Ephraim turned to face her, and Clara was shocked by the change in his appearance. His usual controlled demeanor had been replaced by something harder, more dangerous. This was the face that had built an empire through force and intimidation, the face that lesser men saw in their nightmares. "Deputy Marshal Hayes paid me a visit last night," Ephraim said without preamble. "He had some interesting questions about my new kitchen help." Clara's world tilted sickeningly, but she forced herself to meet his gaze directly. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest you haven't been entirely honest about your background." Ephraim moved to his desk and picked up a folded paper, handling it like it might explode. "Care to explain why there's a warrant for your arrest, Mrs. Blackwood?" The name hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 years running from it, 3 years trying to forget she'd ever been Marcus Blackwood's wife. Hearing it spoken aloud in Ephraim's voice made her feel exposed, vulnerable, stripped of all the protective layers she'd built around her new identity. "I go by Whitlock now," she said quietly. "Whitlock was my maiden name." "I don't care what name you use. I care that you lied to me from the moment you set foot on my land." Ephraim's voice rose slightly, controlled fury bleeding through his professional demeanor. "I care that harboring you could destroy everything I've built here." Clara stood slowly, her legs unsteady but her spine straight. "What exactly did Deputy Hayes tell you?" "That you murdered your husband in cold blood. That you fled the scene before the law could arrest you. That Judge Blackwood has offered a substantial reward for information leading to your capture." Ephraim's dark eyes bored into hers. "Is any of that untrue?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that would determine the course of both their futures. Clara could lie, could fabricate some alternative explanation that might preserve the fragile trust they'd built. But lies had brought her to this moment, and more lies would only make the eventual reckoning worse. "I killed him," she said simply, "but not in cold blood. In self-defense, though the law will never see it that way." Ephraim's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eye, surprise, perhaps, at her directness. Self-defense? Marcus was, not the man he appeared to be in public. Judge Blackwood was respected, admired, seen as a pillar of the community. But behind closed doors, he was someone else entirely. Clara's voice remained steady despite the pain of remembering. He enjoyed inflicting pain, especially on those who couldn't fight back. "The night I killed him, he'd gone too far. I had to choose between his life and my own. You could have left him, sought help from the authorities." Clara laughed bitterly. Marcus was the authorities. His father was a federal judge. His brothers held positions in the territorial government. Who would have believed a farmer's daughter over a respected jurist? Who would have risked their career to help a nobody wife escape a somebody husband? The words carried the weight of absolute conviction, born from bitter experience with the way power protected its own. Ephraim studied her face with the intensity of a man trying to read truth from shadows and half-spoken revelations. "So you killed him and ran." "I defended myself and fled. There's a difference, though the law doesn't recognize it." Clara straightened her shoulders, meeting his judgment with quiet dignity. "I won't apologize for surviving, Mr. Kane. I won't pretend to regret choosing my life over his convenience." Ephraim moved to the window again, his broad frame silhouetted against the morning light. For long minutes he stood in silence while Clara waited for the verdict that would determine her fate. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than condemning. "Hayes is coming back tomorrow. He expects me to turn you over to his custody." Clara felt the bottom drop out of her world. "I understand. I'll be gone before he arrives." "Like hell you will." The words were spoken with such vehemence that Clara started in surprise. Ephraim turned from the window, his expression fierce with protective determination. "You belong to me, remember? That was our agreement. No deputy marshal gets to take my property without just cause, and I don't consider self-defense just cause for anything except commendation. Hope flared in Clara's chest, dangerous and intoxicating. You're willing to risk trouble with the law for me. I'm willing to risk trouble for what's right. There's a difference. Ephraim's smile was sharp as a blade, promising retribution for anyone who threatened what he considered his. Besides, Deputy Hayes strikes me as the kind of man who might be open to reason, especially if that reason comes with adequate financial incentive. The implication was clear. Ephraim intended to buy her freedom, to use his wealth and influence to make Clara's legal troubles disappear. It was a generous offer, more than she had any right to expect from an employer who'd known her less than 2 months. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk your reputation, your standing in the community, for someone you barely know?" Ephraim's expression softened fractionally, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the harsh exterior. "Because I know enough. I know you risked your life to save animals in a storm. I know you've earned the respect of every man on this ranch through honest work and genuine kindness. I know you see good in broken things and have the courage to fight for what you believe in." He paused, seeming to wrestle with words that didn't come easily. "And because I understand what it means to lose everything and have to start over. The difference is, I had resources to rebuild. You had nothing but determination and hope." Clara felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. She'd spent 3 years convinced that her past made her unworthy of protection or care, that the blood on her hands marked her as irredeemably tainted. Ephraim's faith in her character felt like absolution she'd never dared to seek. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay such kindness. Keep being who you are. Keep proving that my faith isn't misplaced." Ephraim's voice grew stern again, but underlying warmth tempered its harshness. "And no more lies between us. I need to know what we're dealing with if I'm going to protect you properly." Clara nodded, understanding that her survival now depended on complete honesty, with the one man powerful enough to shield her from the past. It was a terrifying vulnerability, but also a relief after years of carrying her secrets alone. "There's more," she said. "Things about Marcus, about why he became so obsessed with controlling me. Things that make him even more dangerous in death than he ever was in life." Ephraim settled into his chair, his attention focused entirely on her words. "Tell me everything. Leave nothing out." And so Clara began the story she'd never told another living soul, the full truth about Marcus Blackwood's depravity, her desperate escape, and the powerful family that would never stop hunting her. With each word, she felt lighter, as if sharing the burden made it bearable at last. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Blood Mesa Ranch, illuminating a day that would change everything for 2 souls who'd found each other in the wilderness of their separate griefs. Ephraim's father's Colt, 45, rested in its holster on his hip like a familiar weight, its worn leather grip shaped by 3 generations of Kane hands. The weapon had belonged to his grandfather before him, passed down through bloodlines that understood violence as both tool and birthright. Every scratch on its barrel told a story of frontier justice. Every notch in its handle marked a life taken in defense of family honor. Now, as Ephraim stood on his porch watching Deputy Hayes approach with 2 armed men, he wondered if today would add another notch to the family legacy. The deputy was exactly what Ephraim had expected, a small man with narrow eyes, and the pinched expression of someone who'd spent his life resenting those more successful than himself. His companions were cut from rougher cloth, hired guns masquerading as lawmen with badges that probably came from the same corrupt system that had protected Marcus Blackwood. "Mr. Kane," Hayes called as he dismounted, "I trust you've had time to consider our conversation." "I have," Ephraim replied, not moving from his position of advantage on the elevated porch. "And I've decided that you're mistaken about my employee." Hayes's face darkened with the frustrated anger of a small man accustomed to having his authority questioned. "There's no mistake. Clara Blackwood is a wanted fugitive, and you're legally obligated to surrender her to my custody. Clara Whitlock is a valued member of my household staff," Ephraim corrected, deliberately emphasizing the name she'd chosen for herself. "Any resemblance to your fugitive is purely coincidental." The deputy's hand drifted toward his sidearm, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the ranch hands, who'd begun gathering at strategic points around the courtyard. Pete McReady stood near the barn with a rifle cradled casually in his arms, while Tommy Rodriguez and 3 other men positioned themselves behind water troughs and equipment that would provide cover if shooting started. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Kane," Hayes said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "I've got federal warrants and territorial authority. You're just a rancher, no matter how much land you own." Ephraim smiled, the expression cold as winter death. "Just a rancher? Deputy, I think you've been misinformed about exactly who you're dealing with." He descended the porch steps slowly, his hand resting on his gun butt in a gesture that was both casual and unmistakably threatening. At his full height, Ephraim towered over the deputy by nearly a foot, his presence radiating the kind of controlled violence that made lesser men reconsider their life choices. "I own 10,000 acres of prime grazing land," Ephraim said conversationally. "I employ nearly 30 men who'd follow me into hell if I asked them. I have business relationships with every banker and politician within 200 miles. My cattle feed 3 territories, and my word carries more weight than any piece of paper you might be carrying." Hayes swallowed hard but held his ground. "The law is the law, Kane. You can't buy your way out of harboring a fugitive." "Can't I?" Ephraim's smile widened. "Deputy, I think we need to discuss the finer points of territorial jurisdiction. Specifically, the question of whether your warrant has any validity on land that technically falls under Apache treaty agreements." The claim was, dubious Ephraim's title was clear and legally registered, but it introduced enough uncertainty to give Hayes pause. Frontier law was a complex web of federal authority, territorial claims, and treaty obligations that often conflicted with each other. A smart man could exploit those contradictions, especially when he had the resources to hire lawyers who understood the system's weaknesses. "You're bluffing," Hayes said, but uncertainty colored his voice. "Am I? Would you like to spend the next 6 months in federal court arguing the validity of your arrest while I file counterclaims and jurisdictional challenges? Because I have the time and money for that kind of legal warfare. Do you?" The threat was real, and they both knew it. Hayes represented the kind of small-time corruption that thrived on quick, easy victories over defenseless victims. A protracted legal battle with a man of Ephraim's resources would bankrupt the deputy long before it reached resolution. "There's another option," Ephraim continued, his tone becoming almost friendly. "One that serves everyone's interests without unnecessary complications." Hayes's eyes narrowed with the calculating look of a man who recognized the prelude to a bribe. "What kind of option?" "The kind where you realize you made an honest mistake, where you discover that the woman you're looking for bears only a superficial resemblance to my kitchen help. Where you return to your superiors with a report that clears up this unfortunate confusion." Ephraim reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of gold coins. "Such mistakes are understandable, of course. Frontier life makes identification difficult, and a conscientious lawman might reasonably conclude that he'd followed a false lead. No shame in that." The pouch landed in the dust at Hayes's feet with a heavy thud that spoke of substantial weight, enough gold to buy a small ranch or a deputy's selective blindness. The 2 hired guns flanking Hayes stared at the money with obvious hunger, their loyalty suddenly questionable in the face of such temptation. $500, Ephraim said, for an honest mistake and the wisdom to avoid compound errors. Hayes stared at the pouch for long seconds, greed warring with whatever genuine conviction might have brought him to Blood Mesa. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed calculation, replacing righteousness, pragmatism, overriding duty. "I suppose mistakes do happen," he said slowly, "and Clara Whitlock is a common enough name. Could be I was chasing shadows." "A reasonable conclusion," Ephraim agreed, "and one that saves everyone considerable trouble." Hayes dismounted and retrieved the pouch, testing its weight with the practiced touch of a man familiar with corruption. His companions relaxed visibly as he tucked the gold into his saddlebags, their hands moving away from their weapons. "Of course, there might be other interested parties," Hayes said with the sly look of a man pushing his luck. "Other lawmen who might not be so reasonable about jurisdictional complexities." Ephraim's expression didn't change, but the temperature around him seemed to drop several degrees. "Deputy, you strike me as an intelligent man. Intelligent enough to understand that some wells can only be poisoned once before they become permanently toxic." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Hayes had received his payment, but any attempt to return for additional bribes would be met with the kind of frontier justice that left men face down in unmarked graves. The deputy's face paled as he grasped the implications. "No other parties," he said quickly. "This was a dead end, far as anyone needs to know. Case closed." "Excellent. I trust your journey back to town will be safe and uneventful." The dismissal was clear, and Hayes wasted no time remounting his horse. His companions followed suit, their eager desire to leave evident in every movement. Within minutes, the three men were riding hard toward the horizon, leaving only dust clouds and the memory of a confrontation that could have ended very differently. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Clara emerged from the main house, where she'd been watching from an upstairs window. Her face was pale but composed, her storm-grey eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude and relief. "Is it over?" she asked. "For now," Ephraim replied, his hand still resting on his gun. "Hayes won't be back, but there might be others. Judge Blackwood has powerful friends and a long memory." Clara nodded, understanding the reality of her situation. The reprieve was temporary, bought with gold and intimidation rather than genuine legal resolution. Her past would continue to hunt her as long as Marcus Blackwood's family demanded justice for their fallen patriarch. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Risk everything for someone you've known less than 2 months." Ephraim studied her face in the afternoon light, noting the courage that kept her chin raised despite her fear, the dignity that prevented her from groveling for protection she couldn't repay. Clara Whitlock was remarkable in ways that had nothing to do with her beauty, valuable in ways that transcended any business arrangement. "Because some things are worth fighting for," he said simply, "and because a man who won't protect what's his doesn't deserve to keep it." The possessive pronoun hung in the air between them, carrying implications that both thrilled and terrified Clara. She was his not as property, but as something precious enough to defend against any threat. The distinction mattered more than she could express. "I don't want to bring trouble to your door," she said, "if staying here puts you at risk." Clara, her name on his lips, stopped her protest mid-sentence. "You're not going anywhere. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be." The declaration was simple but absolute, spoken with the authority of a man who'd built an empire through strength of will and wasn't accustomed to having his decisions questioned. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way Ephraim looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Ephraim nodded and turned toward the barn, where the day's work waited despite the morning's drama. But Clara's voice stopped him before he'd taken 3 steps. Ephraim, the use of his first name was deliberate, intimate, a crossing of boundaries they'd both carefully maintained. "That gun your father's gun. Were you prepared to use it?" He looked back over his shoulder, his dark eyes holding truths she'd only begun to understand. "For you, I was prepared to use everything." The admission hung between them like a promise and a threat, evidence of depths in Ephraim Kane that Clara was only beginning to fathom. He would have killed for her today, would have spilled blood and faced the consequences without hesitation. The knowledge should have frightened her instead. It filled her with a warmth she'd thought lost forever. As Ephraim disappeared into the barn and Clara returned to her duties, both were acutely aware that something fundamental had changed between them. The careful distance they'd maintained was crumbling beneath the weight of shared danger and mutual protection. What had begun as a business arrangement was becoming something far more complex and dangerous, something that could destroy them both or save them from the loneliness that had defined their separate lives. In the western sky, storm clouds were gathering like an omen of troubles yet to come. But for now, in the golden afternoon light of Blood Mesa Ranch, Clara Whitlock was safe under the protection of a man who'd claimed her as his own. The future might bring new threats, new challenges to overcome, but they would face them together, partnership forged in crisis and tempered by trust that ran deeper than either had thought possible. Change was coming to Blood Mesa, carried on the wind and written in the determined expression of a woman who'd found her place worth fighting for. The only question was whether love would prove stronger than the forces arrayed against it, whether hope could triumph over the darkness that pursued them both. The wanted poster crackled in the morning breeze as Deputy Marshal Hayes unfolded it with trembling hands, his face going ashen as he studied the detailed illustration staring back at him. Clara's face gazed from the yellowed paper with startling accuracy, every curve of her cheek, every storm-grey shade of her eyes, every strand of auburn hair captured by an artist skilled enough to make the drawing almost photographic in its precision. But it wasn't Clara Whitlock's face on the poster. It was Clara Blackwood's, and beneath the illustration, words that made Hayes's stomach turn with the realization of what he'd done. Wanted for murder. Clara Marie Blackwood. 2. Zero reward, dead or alive. Federal warrant issued by order of Territorial Judge Cornelius Blackwood. The amount stopped, Hayes cold. $2,000 was more money than most men saw in 5 years, enough to buy a ranch or start a new life, far from the frontier's hardships. He'd accepted Ephraim Kane's $500 bribe, thinking himself clever, but now he understood the magnitude of his error. Judge Cornelius Blackwood wasn't just any territorial official seeking justice for a murdered son. He was one of the most powerful men in 3 territories, with connections reaching all the way to Washington and the personal authority to destroy anyone who crossed his family. The reward money was proof of his seriousness. No judge offered that kind of gold unless he intended to see results. Hayes read the poster's details with growing horror. Clara wasn't just wanted for murder, she was wanted for the killing of Judge Marcus Blackwood, son of Judge Cornelius Blackwood, in what the warrant described as a premeditated act of domestic treachery resulting in the death of a respected jurist and pillar of the community. The description painted Clara as a cold-blooded killer who'd murdered her husband for his money, then fled with stolen property including jewelry, cash, and important legal documents. There was no mention of self-defense, no suggestion that Marcus Blackwood had been anything other than a devoted husband killed by a greedy wife. But Hayes had looked into Clara's eyes yesterday, had seen the genuine fear and quiet dignity that spoke to innocence rather than guilt. Either she was the most accomplished actress in the territory, or the official version of events bore little resemblance to the truth. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Hayes fold the poster quickly and shove it into his saddlebags. A lone rider was approaching from the east, moving with the purposeful urgency of someone carrying important news. As the figure drew closer, Hayes recognized the uniform of a federal marshal, not a territorial deputy like himself, but a representative of the United States government with authority that superseded local jurisdiction. "You, Hayes?" the marshal called as he reined in his lathered horse. "I am. You got business with me?" The marshal dismounted and extended a hand in greeting. He was a lean man in his 40s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years chasing outlaws across hostile territory. His badge was genuine federal silver, and his credentials were undoubtedly more impressive than Hayes's territorial appointment. "Marshal William Carson, Federal District Court. I'm here about the Blackwood woman. Heard you might have a lead on her whereabouts." Hayes felt sweat breaking out across his forehead despite the morning chill. "Clara Blackwood? Haven't seen hide nor hair of her in these parts. Dead end, far as I can tell." Carson's pale blue eyes studied Hayes with the intensity of a man trained to spot lies. "That's interesting. Judge Blackwood received information suggesting she was working at the Kane Ranch. Seemed like reliable intelligence. Well, whoever told him that was mistaken, Hayes said, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. I investigated personally. There's a woman named Clara Whitlock working Kane's kitchen, but she's nothing like the description we got. Different coloring, different build, different everything. Mind if I take a look for myself? The question was polite, but Hayes heard the steel beneath Carson's courtesy. A federal marshal didn't make requests. She made statements that sounded like requests until you tried to refuse them. Course not, Hayes said, his mind racing through options that all led to disaster. Though I should mention that Kane's particular about uninvited visitors. Man's got a reputation for being unfriendly to strangers. Carson smiled, the expression holding no warmth whatsoever. I've dealt with unfriendly ranchers before. Usually find they become more cooperative once they understand the consequences of obstructing federal investigations. The two men rode toward Blood Mesa Ranch in tense silence, Hayes desperately trying to formulate a plan that wouldn't end with him in federal prison. He'd accepted Ephraim's bribe, thinking the matter closed. But now he faced the prospect of explaining to a federal marshal why he'd abandoned his investigation after a single conversation. As the ranch buildings came into view, Hayes spotted Clara hanging laundry behind the main house. Even at a distance, her resemblance to the wanted poster was unmistakable. Any lawman with working eyes would identify her within seconds, ending Hayes's hopes of keeping his corruption secret. That her? Carson asked, following Hayes's gaze. That's Clara Whitlock, Hayes replied, putting emphasis on the surname. Like I said, different woman entirely. Carson spurred his horse forward, and Hayes had no choice but to follow. They reached the ranch yard to find Ephraim emerging from the barn, his massive frame and cold expression making his displeasure with unexpected visitors abundantly clear. Marshal Carson, Federal District Court, the lawman announced, showing his credentials. I'm investigating the whereabouts of a fugitive named Clara Blackwood. Deputy Hayes tells me you've got a woman named Clara Whitlock working here. Ephraim's dark eyes flicked to Hayes, and the deputy saw death in that gazea promise of retribution that made his blood run cold. Kane understood the betrayal immediately, realized that Hayes had returned, despite their agreement, bringing federal attention that endangered everything they'd tried to protect. I do, Ephraim said carefully. Though I fail to see how my employee's identity concerns federal authorities. It concerns us when that employee matches the description of a wanted killer, Carson replied. Mind calling her over so I can have a look? The request was reasonable, inevitable, and utterly devastating. Hayes watched Ephraim's jaw tighten as he weighed his options, all of which led to Clara's exposure and arrest. The rancher was trapped by circumstances beyond his control, facing a federal marshal who wouldn't be swayed by bribes or territorial politics. Clara, Ephraim called, his voice carrying across the yard with forced casualness. Come here a moment. Clara approached slowly, her intuition clearly warning her of danger. She'd changed from her work dress into a simple blue cotton blouse and dark skirt, her auburn hair pinned back in a style that emphasized the elegant line of her neck. To Hayes, she looked exactly like the woman in the wanted posterso, exactly that denial would be impossible. Ma'am, Marshal Carson said, tipping his hat politely, I'm investigating reports of a fugitive who might be in this area. Woman named Clara Blackwood, wanted in connection with her husband's murder. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Clara's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. I'm Clara Whitlock, Marshal. I've never been married. Carson studied her with professional scrutiny, his pale eyes taking in every detail of her appearance. Hayes held his breath, hoping against hope that the marshal might accept her denial, despite the obvious resemblance. Interesting, Carson said finally, because you bear a remarkable similarity to this woman. He produced the wanted poster with theatrical timing, unfolding it so Clara could see her own face staring back at her. The illustration was damning in its accuracy. No reasonable person could claim it depicted someone else. Clara looked at the poster for long seconds, her expression cycling through shock, fear, and finally a kind of resigned dignity. When she raised her eyes to meet Carson's gaze, Hayes saw the exact moment she decided to stop running. "That's me," she said quietly. "I am Clara Blackwood, and I did kill my husband." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Carson nodded with satisfaction, while Ephraim's expression darkened with protective fury. Hayes felt sick, knowing his greed had brought this moment to pass. "Clara Blackwood," Carson said formally, "you're under arrest for the murder of Judge Marcus Blackwood. You have the right—" "She killed him in self-defense?" Ephraim interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Marcus Blackwood was a violent man who terrorized his wife. She acted to protect her own life." Carson's expression didn't change. "That's for a jury to decide, Mr. Kane. My job is to bring her back for trial. Your job is to serve justice." Ephraim corrected, stepping closer to Clara in a gesture of protection. "And there's no justice in prosecuting a woman for defending herself against a brutal husband. The law disagrees. Marcus Blackwood was a respected judge, and his widow killed him with a letter opener during what witnesses described as a domestic dispute. That's murder, regardless of the circumstances." "What witnesses?" Clara asked sharply. "There were no witnesses. Marcus and I were alone in his study when it happened." Carson consulted a leather portfolio, his expression professional and unsympathetic. "According to the report filed by Judge Cornelius Blackwood, your husband's father, the household staff heard raised voices followed by your husband's cries for help. When they entered the study, they found Judge Marcus Blackwood bleeding to death from stab wounds while you stood over him with the murder weapon." "That's a lie," Clara said, her voice rising with indignation. "The staff was dismissed early that evening on Marcus's orders. No one heard anything because no one was there to hear." "Are you calling Judge Blackwood a liar, ma'am?" The question was a trap, and they all knew it. Accusing a sitting federal judge of perjury was tantamount to legal suicide, regardless of the truth behind the accusation. "I'm saying his grief has colored his memory," Clara replied carefully. "People sometimes remember things differently when they're in pain." Carson smiled coldly. "Well, you'll have plenty of opportunity to present your version of events at trial. Judge Blackwood is eager to see justice done for his son." "Judge Blackwood will be presiding over the trial?" Ephraim asked, his tone sharpening with new understanding. "Of course, as the victim's father and the senior federal judge in the territory, he has both the authority and the personal interest necessary to ensure proper proceedings." The revelation was devastating in its implications. Clara would be tried by her victim's father, judged by a man who had every reason to see her convicted, regardless of evidence or testimony. It was a mockery of justice disguised as legal procedure. "That's not justice," Ephraim said. "That's revenge." "That's the law," Carson replied, "and I'm here to enforce it." He produced a pair of iron shackles from his saddlebags, their weight and coldness a stark reminder of Clara's fate. "Ma'am, I'll need you to extend your hands." "No." The word came from Ephraim with such force that Carson's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm. "You're not taking her anywhere." "Mr. Kane, don't make this harder than it has to be. Interfering with a federal arrest is a serious crime." "So is judicial corruption," Ephraim shot back. "So is allowing an innocent woman to be railroaded by a vengeful father masquerading as an impartial judge." The standoff stretched, taut as a bowstring, 3 men and 1 woman frozen in a moment that would determine all their futures. Hayes watched from his horse, acutely aware that his betrayal had created this crisis, and equally aware that any attempt to intervene would only make things worse. "There's something else," Clara said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. "Something that changes everything about this case." Carson's eyebrows rose with professional interest. "What's that, ma'am?" Clara reached into her blouse and withdrew a folded paper that Hayes recognized as different from the letter she'd hidden so carefully. This document was newer, official-looking, with the kind of heavy paper and formal seals that marked important legal correspondence. "This is a letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office," she said, unfolding the document with hands that shook only slightly. "It's an investigation report into Judge Marcus Blackwood's conduct, compiled over the course of 2 years leading up to his death." Carson frowned, clearly not expecting this development. "What kind of investigation?" "The kind that documents systematic judicial corruption, bribery, and abuse of power. The kind that was about to result in Marcus's removal from the bench and possible criminal charges." Clara's voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by the power of truth finally spoken aloud. "I didn't kill my husband in a moment of passion, Marshal. I killed him the night before he was to be arrested by federal authorities for crimes that would have destroyed the Blackwood family's reputation forever." The revelation struck the gathered men like a physical blow. Hayes felt his worldview shifting as pieces of a larger puzzle fell into place. Carson's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing genuine surprise beneath his official demeanor. "That's impossible," Carson said. "Judge Blackwood was a respected member of the judiciary. There were never any formal charges filed against him." "Because he died before the investigation could be completed," Clara replied. "But the evidence was overwhelming. Bribery, extortion, influence peddling Marcus had turned his courtroom into a marketplace where justice went to the highest bidder." She extended the document toward Carson, who took it with visible reluctance. "Read it yourself, Marshal. Every charge is documented, every crime detailed with dates, witnesses, and corroborating evidence. Marcus Blackwood wasn't the victim of domestic violence. He was a criminal who got exactly what he deserved." Carson scanned the document's contents, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Hayes could see the marshal's certainty crumbling as he read testimony that painted Marcus Blackwood not as a martyred judge, but as a corrupt official who'd perverted justice for personal gain. "This changes things," Carson admitted finally, "if these allegations are true." "They are true," Clara interrupted, "and Judge Cornelius Blackwood knows they're true. That's why he's so determined to see me executed not for justice, but to silence the only witness who can testify to his son's crimes. My death closes the investigation permanently and preserves the family's reputation." The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap, recontextualizing everything they thought they knew about Clara's case. Hayes felt sick as he realized the magnitude of the corruption he'd become entangled in, while Ephraim's expression showed grim satisfaction at having his suspicions confirmed. "Ma'am," Carson said slowly, "these are very serious allegations. If you have evidence that Judge Blackwood is using his position to pursue a personal vendetta—" "I have evidence," Clara said firmly. "Documents, correspondence, witness testimony, everything the Attorney General's investigators compiled before Marcus's death cut short their work. It's all hidden in a place where even Judge Blackwood can't reach it." Carson studied the letter again, his trained eye clearly recognizing the authenticity of official federal correspondence. When he looked up, his expression had changed completely, the cold professionalism replaced by genuine concern for justice rather than mere law enforcement. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said formally, "I think we need to have a much longer conversation about this matter, away from prying ears and in a place where we can examine all the evidence properly." The words offered hope where moments before there had been only despair. Clara felt tears of relief threatening as she realized that truth might finally have found its champion in the form of an honest federal marshal. But as Carson folded the investigation report and tucked it carefully into his portfolio, none of them noticed the figure, watching from the distant ridger man with field glasses and the patient stillness of a professional hunter who'd finally located his prey. Judge Cornelius Blackwood had sent more than one marshal to Blood Mesa Ranch, and the backup plan was already in motion. Sarah's wedding dress hung in the wardrobe like a ghost made of ivory silk and faded dreams, its pearl buttons catching the lamplight as Ephraim lifted it from its resting place with reverent hands. The fabric still held the faint scent of lavender from sachets his dead wife had tucked among its folds, a fragrance that brought memories flooding back with overwhelming intensity. "Are you certain about this?" Clara asked softly, her storm-grey eyes reflecting the uncertainty that plagued them both. Using your wife's dress, it seems wrong somehow. Sacred. Ephraim turned the dress toward the light, studying the intricate lacework Sarah had spent months perfecting during their engagement. Every stitch had been placed with love, every detail crafted with the hope of a woman who believed in forever. Now it would serve a different purpose, clothing another woman for a ceremony born of desperation rather than romance. Sarah would approve, he said finally. She believed in protecting the innocent, in fighting for what's right. This is both. The decision to marry Clara had come to him during the long night hours after Marshal Carson's revelation, as he'd paced his study and contemplated the forces arrayed against the woman who'd somehow become essential to his existence. Marriage would grant Clara legal protections that no amount of money could buy, the right to refuse testimony against her husband, the shield of respectability that came with being Mrs. Ephraim Kane, the sanctuary of a union that even Judge Blackwood would hesitate to dissolve. But more than legal strategy drove his proposal. The thought of losing Clara to the corrupt justice system that had already failed her once was unbearable in ways that transcended mere protective instinct. She'd become part of Blood Mesa Ranch, woven into its daily rhythms as thoroughly as if she'd been born to this life. The idea of facing tomorrow without her humming in the kitchen or her gentle hands tending his horses was simply unthinkable. "I still don't understand why you're willing to do this," Clara said, accepting the dress from his hands with careful reverence. "Marriage is sacred, permanent. You barely know me." "I know enough," Ephraim replied, the same words he'd spoken when defending her to Deputy Hayes. "I know you're brave, kind, and strong enough to survive anything life throws at you. I know you care for broken things and see beauty where others see only damage. I know you've never asked for anything you haven't earned through honest work." He paused, struggling with emotions that 5 years of carefully constructed numbness had left him ill-equipped to express. "And I know that losing you would be like losing Sarah all over again, except this time I have the power to prevent it." Clara's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "What if I'm not worth the risk? What if protecting me destroys everything you've built here?" "Then we'll build something new together." The certainty in his voice surprised them both. "Clara, I've spent 5 years existing rather than living, surviving rather than thriving. You've reminded me what it feels like to hope for tomorrow instead of just enduring it." The admission hung between them like a bridge, spanning the gap between employer and employee, protector and protected, two damaged souls who'd found healing in each other's company. Clara understood that Ephraim was offering more than marriage. He was offering partnership, belonging, the chance to stop running and start building a life worth defending. "When?" she asked simply. "Tonight. Doc Morrison can perform the ceremony, and Pete can stand as witness. By morning, you'll be Clara Kane, and any legal action against you will have to go through me first." The speed was necessary, but also symbolic a leap of faith that left no time for second thoughts or careful deliberation. Sometimes the most important decisions had to be made from the heart rather than the head, guided by instinct rather than logic. As Clara retreated to prepare for the ceremony, Ephraim made his way to the bunkhouse where his ranch hands were gathering for their evening meal. The time had come to test loyalties that had been built over years of shared hardship and mutual respect. What he was about to ask of them went far beyond the normal duties of hired men. "Listen up," he called, his voice cutting through the usual dinner conversation. "I need to know where you stand, because what I'm about to tell you could put every man here in danger." The room fell silent as 23 faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. These were hard men, veterans of range wars and cattle drives, but they'd chosen to work for Ephraim Kane because they respected his leadership and trusted his judgment. "Some of you know that Clara's been having trouble with the law," Ephraim began. "What you don't know is that the law is corrupt, bought and paid for by powerful men who want her dead not for justice but for revenge." He outlined the situation with brutal honesty: Clara's self-defense killing of an abusive husband, Judge Blackwood's vendetta, The federal investigation that painted Marcus Blackwood as a criminal rather than a victim. When he finished, the silence stretched long enough to hear the wind whistling through the eaves. Old Pete spoke first, his weathered voice carrying the authority of age and experience. "So what you're saying is, we got federal marshals and corrupt judges coming after one of ours?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, and I'm asking each of you to decide whether you're willing to fight for what's right, even if it means going against official authority." Tommy Rodriguez stood up, his young face set with determination. "Miss Clara saved my horse when he had colic, stayed up all night nursing him back to health when she could have been sleeping. Anyone wants to hurt her goes through me first." Similar declarations followed from around the room, stories of Clara's kindness, her competence, her quiet dignity in the face of hardship. One by one, Ephraim's men declared their loyalty not just to him, but to the woman who'd earned their respect through honest work and genuine care. "There's more," Ephraim said, when the room quieted. "Clara and I are getting married tonight. That makes her family, and family is worth dying for." The announcement brought a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. Several men nodded approvingly, clearly having suspected that their boss's feelings for Clara went beyond mere protectiveness. "About time," Pete observed with a grin. "Been watching you two dance around each other for weeks now. Good for both of you." The next hour passed in a blur of preparation and positioning. Ephraim's men spread out across the ranch, taking up defensive positions that would allow them to spot approaching threats while maintaining the illusion of normal activity. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, ammunition distributed, escape routes planned in case the situation deteriorated beyond control. Doc Morrison arrived as the sun was setting, his medical bag supplemented by the leather-bound Bible he'd inherited from his preacher father. The elderly physician had performed numerous marriages over his decades of frontier service, but never one conducted under such dangerous circumstances. "Ephraim," he said quietly, "are you sure about this? Marriage should be about love, not legal maneuvering." "It's about both," Ephraim replied. "I won't lie and claim this is purely romantic, but it's not purely strategic either. Clara means something to me, something I thought I'd lost forever when Sarah died." Doc Morrison studied his friend's face in the lamplight, seeing emotions there that had been absent for 5 long years. "Sarah would be happy for you. She never wanted you to grieve forever." The ceremony took place in Ephraim's study, with Pete and Tommy serving as witnesses and the rest of the ranch hands maintaining their vigilant watch outside. Clara entered wearing Sarah's wedding dress, the ivory silk transformed by her presence into something new and beautiful, rather than merely borrowed. The dress fit as if it had been made for her, emphasizing her natural grace and the quiet strength that had first caught Ephraim's attention. Her auburn hair was pinned up with Sarah's pearl combs, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Pete had hastily gathered from the meadow behind the barn. "Dearly beloved," Doc Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and hope, "we are gathered here tonight to unite Ephraim Kane and Clara Whitlock in holy matrimony." The words washed over them like a blessing, transforming a desperate strategy into something sacred despite the circumstances. When Doc Morrison asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence was broken only by the distant sound of night birds and the soft whisper of wind through the open window. "Do you, Ephraim Kane, take Clara Whitlock to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" "I do," Ephraim said, his voice strong and certain. "Do you, Clara Whitlock, take Ephraim Kane to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Clara's voice was soft but unwavering. "I do." The ring Ephraim slipped onto her finger was Sarah's wedding band, sized to fit Clara's slender hand through some miracle of providence. The gold was warm against her skin, carrying the weight of promises made and the hope of promises yet to be fulfilled. "By the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Ephraim, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, reverent, full of promise rather than passion. But as Ephraim's lips touched Clara's, both felt something shift between them, the artificial boundaries of their previous relationship, dissolving into something deeper, more honest, more real. "Ladies and gentlemen," Doc Morrison announced with satisfaction, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Ephraim Kane." The celebration was necessarily brief and subdued, with the constant awareness that danger could arrive at any moment. But for a few precious minutes, they allowed themselves to savor the joy of union, the hope of a future built on mutual respect and growing love. As midnight approached and the wedding guests departed to resume their vigilant watch, Ephraim and Clara found themselves alone in the study where their new life had officially begun. The marriage certificate lay on the desk, its official seals and signatures transforming Clara from fugitive to protected wife in the eyes of the law. "No regrets?" Ephraim asked, studying Clara's face in the lamplight. "None," she replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Whatever happens tomorrow, tonight I belong somewhere. Tonight I'm not running." Ephraim nodded, understanding the profound significance of belonging for someone who'd spent years as a rootless fugitive. "You're home now, Clara. Whatever comes, we face it together." Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, while armed men maintained their watch against threats both seen and unseen. Change was coming to Blood Mesa Ranch, carried on the wind and written in the determined expressions of people who'd found something worth defending. The greatest battle of their lives was about to begin, but Ephraim and Clara Kane would face it united by more than marriage vows. They were bound by choice, strengthened by trust, and protected by the kind of love that grew stronger under pressure rather than weaker. Tomorrow would bring Judge Blackwood's wrath, federal complications, and violence that would test every bond they'd forged. But tonight, in the golden glow of lamplight and the soft whisper of wedding silk, Clara Kane was finally, truly safe in the arms of a man who'd claimed her as his own and meant to keep her forever. The ranch gate stood like a sentinel against the dawn, its wooden crossbeam bearing the burned letters Kane Ranch that had announced Ephraim's dominion over Blood Mesa for 20 years. Now it served a different purpose, the last line between sanctuary and the force of corrupt law riding hard across the desert, their dust cloud visible on the horizon like an approaching storm. Judge Cornelius Blackwood sat his horse with the rigid posture of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. His black robes billowing in the morning wind like the wings of some carrion bird come to feast on justice's corpse. Behind him rode 20 armed men, bearing federal badges and territorial authority, their faces set with the grim determination of those who believed themselves servants of righteousness. Ephraim stood at the gate with Clara at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, in a gesture that proclaimed their unity to anyone with eyes to see. She wore a simple blue dress rather than the wedding gown of the previous night, but the gold band on her finger caught the morning light like a shield against the approaching darkness. "That's close enough," Ephraim called when the riders were still 50 yards away. His voice carried across the space between them with the authority of a man defending his own ground against unwelcome intruders. Judge Blackwood raised his hand, signaling his men to halt. Up close, he was a formidable figure despite his 60-odd-year stall, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that had built careers and destroyed enemies across 3 decades of judicial service. His eyes, pale blue and cold as winter ice, fixed on Clara, with hatred so pure it was almost tangible. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a courtroom pronouncement, "you've led us quite a chase, but it ends here." "Mrs. Kane," Clara corrected firmly. "I married Mr. Kane last evening in a ceremony witnessed and documented according to territorial law." The judge's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those pale eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition that his quarry had found protection he hadn't anticipated. Marriage complicated things legally, creating spousal privileges and property rights that would require careful navigation. How convenient, Blackwood said dryly. A strategic marriage designed to obstruct justice. Such unions can be annulled when they're clearly fraudulent. There's nothing fraudulent about our marriage, Ephraim said, his tone carrying the dangerous calm of a man pushed toward violence. Clara is my wife in every sense that matters legally, morally, and personally. Blackwood studied Ephraim with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating new prey. The rancher's reputation had preceded him, stories of a man who'd built an empire through strength and cunning, who commanded absolute loyalty from his men and had never backed down from a fight when his interests were threatened. Mr. Kane, the judge said with false courtesy, I appreciate your desire to protect what you see as an innocent woman, but Clara Blackwood murdered my son in cold blood, and no amount of frontier chivalry will change that fact. Clara Kane defended herself against a violent criminal, Ephraim replied, emphasizing his wife's married name. Your son was corrupt, Judge. The federal investigation proves it. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly, revealing the raw fury beneath his judicial mask. My son was a respected jurist whose only crime was trusting his wife. The so-called investigation was based on lies and fabricated evidence designed to discredit a man who couldn't defend himself. Then you won't mind if we present that evidence to an impartial court, Clara said, stepping forward despite Ephraim's protective instinct to shield her. Let a jury examine the testimony, review the documents, and decide for themselves whether Marcus was victim or victimizer. You'll get your trial? Blackwood promised, his voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. In my courtroom, under my authority, with justice dispensed according to the letter of the law. The threat was clear. Clara would face trial before the very man who wanted her dead, judged by someone with every reason to see her convicted, regardless of evidence. It was a mockery of justice so blatant that even Blackwood's own men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. That's not justice, Ephraim said. That's revenge disguised as legal procedure. That's the law, Blackwood replied, echoing Marshal Carson's words from the previous day. And I'm here to enforce it. He gestured to his men, who began spreading out in a tactical formation designed to surround the gate and cut off any escape routes. The movement was smooth and practiced, evidence of military training adapted to law enforcement purposes. Clara Blackwood, excuse me, Clara Kane, under arrest for the murder of Judge Marcus Blackwood. Surrender yourself peacefully, and no one else needs to be hurt. She's not going anywhere, Ephraim said flatly. This is my land, and Clara is my wife. You have no authority here. Blackwood smiled, the expression holding no warmth or humor. On the contrary, Mr. Kane, federal warrants supersede local authority, and my jurisdiction extends across the entire territory. Your property rights don't include the right to harbor fugitives. They include the right to protect my family from corrupt officials who abuse their power for personal vendettas. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge to single combat, two powerful men facing each other across the divide between law and justice. Blackwood's men tensed, hands drifting toward weapons as the situation escalated beyond mere legal formalities. Stand down, Mr. Kane, one of the federal marshals called. Don't make this harder than it has to be. It's already as hard as it's going to get, Ephraim replied. Around the ranch yard, his men emerged from their concealed positions, Pete McReady from behind the water trough, Tommy Rodriguez from the barn loft, others from doorways and shadows where they'd maintained their vigilant watch throughout the night. The numbers were roughly 20 federal men against 23 ranch hands, but Ephraim's people had the advantage of fighting on familiar ground with intimate knowledge of every building, fence line, and potential source of cover. They also had the advantage of fighting for something they believed in, rather than merely following orders. Last chance, Judge Blackwood said, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. Surrender the woman or face the consequences of obstructing federal justice. Ephraim's response was to step protectively in front of Clara, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his father's gun. The gesture was unmistakable in its meaning. Any attempt to take his wife would have to go through him first. Judge, he said quietly. "You've made a long ride for nothing. Clara stays here, under my protection, until she gets a fair trial before an impartial court. That's not negotiable." Blackwood's face flushed with rage at the rancher's defiance. He'd expected intimidation and legal pressure to cow Ephraim into compliance, not this stubborn resistance to properly constituted authority. "Marshal Stevens," he barked to one of his men. "Arrest them both. Charge Kane with obstruction of justice and harboring a fugitive." The federal marshal hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with arresting a man of Ephraim's reputation and influence without overwhelming cause. The situation was rapidly deteriorating beyond the bounds of normal law enforcement, entering territory where politics and personal vendettas trumped proper procedure. "Judge," Stevens said carefully, "maybe we should. Maybe you should follow orders," Blackwood snapped, "or find yourself facing charges of dereliction of duty." The threat galvanized the federal men into action. Stevens drew his weapon and spurred his horse forward, signaling his men to advance on the gate. The movement triggered immediate response from Ephraim's ranch hands, who raised their rifles in a show of force that made the federal men rein up sharply. "That's far enough," Pete called from his position behind the water trough, his Winchester trained on Marshal Stevens with the steady aim of a man who'd fought in the Civil War. "This is private property, and you ain't welcome here." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 20 federal men facing 23 ranch hands across 30 yards of open ground. Clara felt her heart pounding with the knowledge that violence was only seconds away, that blood would be spilled because of her past, and Ephraim's determination to protect her. "Stop," she called, stepping forward despite Ephraim's attempt to restrain her. "Stop this right now." Both sides tensed as she walked toward the gate, her hands raised to show she carried no weapons. Judge Blackwood's pale eyes followed her movement with predatory intensity, while Ephraim's jaw clenched with the effort of allowing her to expose herself to danger. "Judge Blackwood," Clara said when she reached the gate, "you want me to stand trial for your son's death. I'm willing to do that, but before an impartial court, with proper legal representation and with all the evidence presented fairly." "The evidence is your confession," Blackwood replied coldly. "You admitted killing Marcus. That's all any jury needs to hear." "I admitted defending myself against a violent criminal who was about to kill me. Your son was corrupt. Judgeth the federal investigation proves that beyond any doubt. The only question is whether you're corrupt too, or just blinded by grief into pursuing revenge instead of justice." The words struck home with devastating accuracy. Blackwood's composure cracked completely, revealing the raw hatred and pain that drove his relentless pursuit of Clara's destruction. "My son was worth 10 of you," he snarled. "He was brilliant, dedicated, destined for greatness before you destroyed him with your lies and manipulation. Your son was a sadist who used his position to abuse anyone weaker than himself." Clara replied with quiet conviction. "I have the scars to prove it, and the testimony of others who suffered under his authority. The truth doesn't die just because you refuse to acknowledge it." Judge Blackwood raised his hand as if to strike her, then caught himself and lowered it slowly. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cold finality of absolute judgment. "You'll hang for what you did to Marcus. I'll see to it personally." "Then you'll be committing judicial murder," Ephraim said, moving to stand beside Clara at the gate. "And I'll make sure the whole territory knows it." The confrontation had reached its breaking point, with neither side willing to back down and violence only a heartbeat away. Judge Blackwood sat his horse like an avatar of vengeful authority, while Ephraim and Clara faced him with the quiet courage of those who'd found something worth dying for. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, fitting backdrop for the battle that was about to determine whether love could triumph over corruption, whether justice could survive when those sworn to protect it became its greatest enemies. Ephraim's lucky horseshoe pressed warm against his chest beneath his shirt, the iron talisman Sarah had given him on their first anniversary, carrying the weight of old promises and new hope. She'd found it in their barn the morning after their wedding, perfectly shaped and still warm from the 4-year sign of good fortune, she'd claimed, that would keep him safe through whatever trials lay ahead. Now, as Judge Blackwood's men drew their weapons and the morning air crackled with the promise of violence. Ephraim touched the horseshoe through his shirt and felt Sarah's presence like a blessing from beyond the grave. Some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the odds, some causes worth dying for, despite the cost. "Last warning," Marshal Stevens called, his revolver trained on Ephraim with the reluctant precision of a man following orders he didn't fully support. "Step away from the fugitive and surrender peacefully." "She's not a fugitive," Ephraim replied, his hand moving to his father's gun with practiced ease. "She's my wife, and she's under my protection." The first shot came from Judge Blackwood himself, his ornate pistol barking flame as he aimed directly at Clara's heart. But Ephraim was already moving, his massive frame intercepting the bullet that would have killed the woman he'd sworn to protect. The lead slug struck the horseshoe beneath his shirt, the iron deflecting it just enough to send it spinning harmlessly into the wooden gate behind him. The sound of gunfire shattered the morning stillness like breaking glass, triggering an explosion of violence that had been building since dawn. Pete McReady's Winchester cracked from behind the water trough, his shot taking down one of Blackwood's men before the federal marshal could clear leather. Tommy Rodriguez fired from the barn loft, his bullet finding its mark in the shoulder of another rider, who tumbled from his saddle with a scream of pain. Ephraim drew his father's Colt in one smooth motion, the weapon feeling like an extension of his will as he returned fire at Judge Blackwood. The corrupt official threw himself sideways in his saddle, the bullet, meant for his heart, instead catching him in the left arm and spinning him around with the force of impact. "Take cover!" Clara shouted, diving behind the stone foundation of the gate as bullets began flying in earnest. Federal men and ranch hands alike sought whatever protection the terrain offered, turning the open space around the entrance into a battlefield where courage and positioning mattered more than official authority. The advantage quickly shifted to Ephraim's men, who knew every inch of the ground they defended and had positioned themselves accordingly. Marshal Stevens found himself pinned behind his horse as Pete's relentless fire kept him from advancing, while two more federal men discovered that the water trough offered better protection to the defenders than to the attackers. "Surrender now." Judge Blackwood screamed from his position behind a dead horse, blood streaming from his wounded arm as he tried to reload his ornate pistol. "You're all under arrest for assaulting federal officers." "You fired first, Judge," Ephraim called back, never taking his eyes off the battlefield as he tracked potential targets. "That makes this self-defense." The distinction mattered in the weird calculus of frontier justice, where the first shot fired often determined who would be seen as aggressor and who as victim. Blackwood's precipitous attack had given Ephraim's men legal as well as moral justification for their resistance. But legal niceties meant little in the heat of combat, where survival depended on shooting straight and taking cover quickly. Another of Blackwood's men fell to Tommy's rifle, his badge providing no protection against lead, fired with righteous conviction. The federal force was being systematically decimated by ranch hands, who fought with the desperate fury of men defending their home. "Fall back," Marshal Stevens ordered, realizing that his position was untenable and his men were dying for a cause that grew more questionable with each passing moment. "Regroup at the ridge." The surviving federal men began a fighting withdrawal, using their horses for cover as they retreated toward higher ground. But Judge Blackwood refused to retreat, his wounded arm forgotten in his obsession with capturing the woman who'd killed his son. "Cowards!" he screamed at his own men. "She's right there, take her." The judge's desperation drove him to break cover, his ornate pistol raised as he charged directly toward Clara's position behind the gate. Ephraim saw the attack developing and moved to intercept, but another federal man chose that moment to fire, the bullet catching Ephraim in the shoulder and spinning him around with bone-jarring force. Clara watched in horror as her husband stumbled, blood spreading across his shirt like a crimson flower. Training and instinct took over, the same calm competence that had served her well in countless crises. She snatched up Pete's backup rifle from where he'd left it by the gate and brought it to her shoulder with fluid precision. Judge Blackwood was perhaps 20 feet away when Clara's shot took him center mass, the heavy slug lifting him off his feet and sending him sprawling backward in the dust. His ornate pistol flew from nerveless fingers as he landed hard, his black robe spreading around him like the wings of a fallen angel. "No!" Marshal Stevens cried, abandoning his position to rush toward his fallen commander. But Pete's rifle barked again, the bullet kicking up dust inches from the marshal's boots and freezing him in place. "Stay where you are," the old foreman commanded. "This fight's over." An eerie silence fell over the battlefield as the surviving federal men realized their leader was down and their cause lost. Judge Blackwood lay motionless in the dust, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the sky, while blood pooled beneath his still form. The man who'd perverted justice for personal revenge had found his own reckoning at the hands of the woman he'd tried to destroy. Clara dropped the rifle and rushed to Ephraim's side, her hands already moving to assess his wound, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd treated many injuries. The bullet had passed through the meat of his shoulder without hitting bone or major blood vessels, painful but not life-threatening with proper care. "I'm all right," Ephraim gasped, his face pale but his eyes still alert. "Just a scratch." "Don't be ridiculous," Clara scolded, tearing strips from her petticoat to fashion a makeshift bandage. "You're bleeding like a stuck pig." Despite the pain and the gravity of their situation, Ephraim found himself smiling at his wife's matter-of-fact treatment of his wound. Clara Kane was proving herself as formidable in crisis as she was gentle in quiet moments, a woman whose courage matched her compassion in perfect balance. "Marshal Stevens," Clara called to the federal officer who stood frozen among his scattered men. "Judge Blackwood is dead. Your orders died with him. What happens now depends on whether you want justice or more bloodshed." Stevens looked around at the battlefield where half his men lay dead or wounded, then at the determined faces of the ranch hands who still held their weapons ready. The tactical situation was hopeless, but more than that, the moral authority he'd relied upon had evaporated with Blackwood's death. "We came here following legal orders," he said uncertainly. "You came here following an illegal vendetta," Clara corrected. Judge Blackwood was pursuing personal revenge, not public justice. His own corruption is documented in federal investigations that will come to light now that he can't suppress them. She stood slowly, her hands visible and unthreatening, but her posture radiating the confidence of someone who held all the winning cards. "You have a choice, Marshal. Withdraw now and report that Judge Blackwood died in the commission of an illegal act, or continue this fight and face the consequences when the truth emerges." Stevens holstered his weapon, the gesture signaling surrender more clearly than any words could have. "We'll withdraw. But this isn't over there. Will be investigations, hearings, legal proceedings." "Good," Clara replied firmly. "I welcome any honest investigation of the facts. The truth has been my ally from the beginning. It just took time to find officials willing to listen to it." As the surviving federal men gathered their wounded and prepared to depart, Clara knelt beside Judge Blackwood's still form and gently closed his sightless eyes. Whatever his crimes, whatever his corruption, he'd been a father grieving his son's death in the only way he knew how. "I'm sorry it came to this," she whispered. "I'm sorry Marcus became what he was, and I'm sorry you couldn't see past your grief to recognize the truth." Ephraim watched his wife perform this final act of mercy and felt his love for her deepen beyond measure. Clara Kane possessed a nobility of spirit that remained intact despite everything she'd endured, a capacity for forgiveness that humbled him even as it filled him with pride. The battle for Blood Mesa Ranch was over, but the war for Clara's freedom had been won through courage, determination, and the kind of love that grew stronger under pressure rather than weaker. Justice had prevailed, not through legal maneuvering or official authority, but through the simple act of good people standing together against corruption and abuse of power. As the federal men rode away toward an uncertain future, Ephraim and Clara Kane stood together in the morning sunlight, bloodied but victorious, their love tested by fire and proven stronger than any force arrayed against it. The future stretched before them like an open road, filled with possibilities that neither had dared imagine when they'd first met beside a creek at dawn. The new ranch sign caught the afternoon sunlight like a promise made tangible, its freshly carved letters proclaiming Kane, Clara Ranch, to anyone who approached the sprawling property that had become synonymous with justice and second chances. 6 months had passed since the confrontation that ended Judge Blackwood's vendetta, 6 months of rebuilding, healing, and learning what it meant to love without fear. Ephraim stood beside Clara on the porch of their rebuilt home, his arm around her waist, as they watched Pete McReady supervise the installation of their new sign. The old foreman had insisted on the joint billing, claiming that Clara's contributions to the ranch's success deserved equal recognition with Ephraim's ownership. It was a sentiment echoed by every man who worked the spread, from Tommy Rodriguez to the newest hands who joined them during the spring expansion. "Looks good," Clara said, leaning into her husband's embrace with the natural ease of a woman who'd found her place in the world. "Though I still think Kane Ranch would have been sufficient." "Not anymore," Ephraim replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, where her auburn hair gleamed like burnished copper in the dying light. "This is our empire now, built by both of us, belonging to both of us." The sign reflects reality. The reality was more beautiful than either had dared hope during those dark days, when federal marshals and corrupt judges had threatened to tear apart everything they'd begun to build together. The investigations following Judge Blackwood's death had vindicated Clara completely, revealing the extent of Marcus Blackwood's corruption and his father's efforts to cover it up. The Territorial Attorney General had formally cleared her of all charges, issuing a public statement that praised her courage in defending herself against a violent criminal. More importantly, the investigations had exposed a network of judicial corruption that reached far beyond the Blackwood family. 14 judges and dozens of court officials had been removed from office, their crimes brought to light by evidence that Marcus had been too arrogant to destroy. Clara's case had become a symbol of justice, delayed but not denied, proof that truth could triumph over power when good people refused to remain silent. The legal vindication had brought practical benefits as well. The territorial government, embarrassed by the scandal and eager to demonstrate their commitment to reform, had awarded Clara substantial compensation for the persecution she'd endured. Combined with Ephraim's existing wealth, they now possessed resources that made them one of the most influential couples in 3 territories. But wealth paled in significance beside the changes Clara had wrought in Ephraim himself. The man who'd once ruled his domain with iron control and emotional isolation had learned to share both authority and affection. Clara's presence had thawed the ice around his heart so completely that visitors often remarked on his transformation from feared tyrant to respected leader whose strength served others rather than merely commanding them. "The Morrison boy's coming along well," Clara observed, nodding toward the young man who was helping Pete with the sign installation. "His mother was right to send him here after the trouble in town." Ephraim nodded, watching 16-year-old Jacob Morrison work with the focused intensity of someone grateful for a second chance. The boy had fallen in with bad companions and nearly destroyed his future with petty crimes and poor decisions. His desperate mother had brought him to the Kane Ranch, begging for work that might save her son from a life of criminality. Clara had seen something worth saving in the sullen teenager, just as she'd seen worth in countless other strays who'd found their way to Blood Mesa over the past months. The ranch had become known throughout the territory as a place where honest work could redeem past mistakes, where people were judged by their actions rather than their histories. "He reminds me of myself at that age," Ephraim admitted, angry at the world, convinced that strength was the only thing that mattered. "If someone hadn't given me a chance to prove myself." "Someone did give you a chance," Clara said softly, "just as we're giving him one. That's what redemption means, the faith that people can change if they're offered the opportunity." The philosophy had become central to their shared vision for the ranch and their role in the community. They hired men other employers wouldn't touch, gave shelter to women fleeing difficult circumstances, and provided food and medicine to families struggling against frontier hardships. Their generosity was practical rather than sentimental, based on the understanding that strong communities required mutual support. As evening deepened and the workers finished their tasks, Clara and Ephraim remained on the porch, savoring the peaceful conclusion to another productive day. The ranch thrived under their joint leadership. Its success measured not just in cattle and profits, but in the lives they'd helped rebuild and the hope they'd restored to people who'd lost faith in their own futures. "There's something I need to tell you," Clara said, her voice carrying a note of nervous excitement that made Ephraim turn to study her face in the lamplight. "Something wonderful that's been happening while you've been so busy with the expansion." Ephraim felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the glow in Clara's storm-grey eyes, the same radiant happiness he'd seen in Sarah's face years ago when she'd shared similar news. "Clara, we're going to have a baby," she whispered, her hand moving to rest on her still, flat stomach. "Doc Morrison confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to be certain before I told you." The words hit Ephraim like a physical blow, overwhelming him with emotions too complex to untangle. Joy warred with fear, hope with the memory of how quickly happiness could be destroyed by forces beyond anyone's control. He'd lost one family to violence. The thought of risking another seemed almost unbearable. But as he looked into Clara's face and saw the love and trust shining there, Ephraim felt his fears dissolving beneath a tide of protective tenderness. This woman had survived her own nightmare and emerged stronger, had faced down corrupt judges and federal marshals without flinching. If anyone could bring new life safely into their dangerous world, it was Clara Kane. "A baby," he said wonderingly, his large hands moving to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, though the answer was written clearly in his expression. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Ephraim replied, pulling her into his arms with careful reverence for the precious life she carried. Terrified, amazed, grateful beyond words, but happy doesn't scratch the surface. They held each other as the stars emerged overhead, two souls who'd found healing in shared love and purpose. The future stretched before them like an unwritten book, its pages filled with possibilities they'd never dared imagine during their separate years of grief and running. "What would you like to name him?" Clara asked. "Him or her? But I have a feeling it's a boy." Clara's smile was mysterious, touched with the ancient wisdom that women carried about such mysteries. Strong like his father, gentle like his mother, with the best qualities of both. Ephraim considered the question seriously, understanding that names carried weight and meaning beyond their mere sound. "If it's a boy, Samuel, it means heard by God, and I think our prayers have been answered beyond what we deserved." "Samuel Kane," Clara tested the name, finding it good. "And if it's a girl?" "Hope," Ephraim said without hesitation, "because that's what you brought back into my life, hope, that tomorrow could be better than today. Hope that love could survive any trial." Clara's eyes filled with tears of happiness as she remembered the horse she'd named Hope during her first week at the ranch, the animal whose healing had marked the beginning of trust between herself and the man who'd become her world. "Hope Kane," she murmured. "I like that. A name that promises better things ahead." As midnight approached and the ranch settled into peaceful quiet, Ephraim and Clara made their way inside to the home they'd built together from the ashes of their separate tragedies. The house was warm with lamplight and filled with the accumulated treasures of their marriage books they'd read together, photographs from their wedding, small gifts exchanged during their courtship. But the greatest treasure was intangible, the love that had grown between them despite impossible odds, the partnership that had transformed them both from broken individuals into something stronger and more complete than either could have been alone. Clara paused at the mantelpiece where Sarah's portrait still held a place of honor, the gentle face smiling down with apparent approval of the happiness that filled the home she'd once shared with Ephraim. "She would be happy for us," Clara said softly, "happy that love found you again." "I think she sent you to me," Ephraim replied, meaning every word. I think she knew I was dying by inches and asked God to send someone who could save me from myself. Then we saved each other, Clara observed. Because I was lost until I found you lost and running, and convinced I didn't deserve peace or happiness. They climbed the stairs to their bedroom hand in hand, two people who'd discovered that the deepest wounds could heal when tended with patience and love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build the life they'd chosen together. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of their shared home, Clara and Ephraim Kane were simply a man and woman grateful for the miracle of second chances. Outside, the wind whispered across Blood Mesa, with promises of rain to green the pastures and nourish the growing things. Change was always coming to the frontier, but some changes brought blessing rather than hardship. The Kane Ranch stood as proof that love could triumph over hate, that justice could prevail against corruption, and that two broken hearts could become whole when they beat in rhythm with each other. In the growing life Clara carried beneath her heart, the future was already taking shape, future built on the foundation of love, tested by fire, and proven stronger than any force arrayed against it. The greatest battles had been fought and won, not through violence, but through the quiet courage of choosing hope over despair, love over loneliness, and each other over the safer path of solitude. The story that had begun with cruelty and ownership had become one of partnership and devotion, proof that sometimes the most unexpected endings were also the most beautiful. On the frontier where mercy was scarce and tenderness seen as weakness, Ephraim and Clara Kane had created something precious and lasting love story for the ages, written in courage and sealed with the promise of new life. As sleep claimed them in each other's arms, both dreamed of the child they would raise together, the legacy they would leave to future generations who would know that love had once triumphed over darkness on Blood Mesa Ranch. The circle was complete, the promise fulfilled, the broken hearts made whole through the miracle of finding each other when hope seemed lost forever.